enterprise information systems. That one I took last term, and then the one before that was the leadership concepts.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Hi, Laura. Hi, Serena.
Hi, Donna. Good to see you.
Oh, hi, Serena. You see, I'm not even registered for this class. Jordan told me to attend it anyways, though.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. That's a detail we can easily work out.
Okay.
You're good.
Oh, is Jordan here?
I'm here.
Yep.
Oh, hey. I hear his voice.
Sorry to disappoint.
Hello.
Hi. So, let's give it another 3 minutes. Should be something like 8 of you, actually. I'm going to see who's in this class now while we're waiting.
Can you guys hear the TV in the background?
No.
Okay.
I'm on the class. Don't come in here. Sorry.
Yep, should be 8 of us.
Is there 8 on?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, waiting for 3 more. Give them about 5-10 minutes.
I've never done a Zoom class before. This is interesting.
This is the way it should be. I'm a big proponent.
Jordan's in his teacher nirvana right now.
I almost
I know.
The pandemic is almost a good thing for me, but I don't even say that. Yeah.
Didn't ask for more.
You're right.
Hey, Jenna. Up here, are you muted, Jenna?
You're seeing Jenna? I don't see Jenna yet.
I see Jenna, and so Alex is no picture, and Ariana, there's no picture.
Okay. Yeah, I see Ariana blank, but I don't see Alex, and I don't see Jenna at all.
Oh, there,
I
yeah.
see Adriana.
I think you have to scroll back out on the top.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. You got it.
I put it in like matrix view or whatever, so it has everybody's square.
Oh.
It's like Hollywood squares.
Oh, I see. Oh, I like that.
Good idea.
I can hear you guys now. Can you guys
I can hear you now.
Yeah, we
Okay.
can hear you.
All right, I'm going to wait. Actually, I think that's, let me just check. Make sure
That's
everyone-
9 people.
9, that should be it. Okay, good. I'm going to get started then.
But-
So,
Hi, everyone.
hi.
Hi.
Let me just get oriented here. So, okay. So, first of all, welcome and thank
Where's
you
Alex?
for putting up with this last minute arrangement. And we're going to make this as fun and educational as possible. And I'm going to take you through, well, first of all, can everybody hear me? That's the first most important thing.
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Great.
Yeah.
And I pretty much can hear all of you. And if I'm not hearing you, it's probably because you're muted. So, I'll give you a little tutorial on Zoom as we go through things. So the goal is for the first half hour or so to take you through what's going to wind up being a very modified syllabus. And you guys kind of lucked out because of a lot less work you're going to wind up doing. But we still want to make sure that you're learning everything. So I'll tell you kind of what the changes are, and we'll go through all that. And then we'll just get into the material. And I try to, I don't try to go 4 hours because it's too much time to begin with now. Everybody's got a crazy life. So I'm going to kind of try to go for 3 with a 15-minute break, and we'll see how that works. And that still gives you time to get dinner afterwards if you want to. Of course, you can eat during the class too. Just send us some of your food, of course. Okay, so what I'm going to do is start sharing my screen. And forgive me, as it takes me a little longer to figure out what I'm doing here. I will get to it. And then the other thing is I am going to be recording pretty much everything starting in about 2 seconds here, because for those who can't make it or those who duck out because of technology issues or whatever the case is, and you want to see the recording, we want you to have that available. So I'm going to record, and if there's an issue with that, let me know. And so here's my screen, and let me just pull up a few things. I'm going to start with the syllabus, which I thought I had up. Apparently I don't. So, oh, I do. I do have my Moodle. Okay. Where'd my Moodle go? These are the things you run into. Okay, so everybody can see my Moodle, yes?
Yes.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So everything that you need is in Moodle for the course, and the only other thing we're using, obviously, is Zoom. So any files you need, any assignments you're going to do, it's all here. And we'll start by clicking on the syllabus and opening that up. And that'll help us take us through the course. And I have to move this over to the right screen. So, okay, there's the syllabus. Now, as I said just a few seconds ago, this thing has been modified, except that it actually hasn't been modified in writing. So I'm going to just go through it and say, hey, this is what you need to do, and this is what you don't need to worry about. So I didn't have time to actually write in the modifications. So what I will do is just prepare a brief summary. It's very simple. I mean, it's not going to be hard to remember, but I will type up what the changes are and send them out to everybody. But let's deal with the syllabus as is. I'm Jordan Holtzman. I know about half of you. The other half are meeting for the first time. So welcome. Just call me Jordan. No titles. Keep it simple. You've got my email. You've got my phone. That's a cell phone. You can text me anytime. I love text because it's quick and you get your answer quickly. And this whole idea of office hours is so stupid. I don't know who came up with that. So when you have first of all, you shouldn't have many problems in this course. This course is very simple to take. And then we're even making it simpler. So, but if you have problems, just send me a text and I'll get you an answer very quickly, or you have my email. If it's more complicated, or God forbid, we should talk on the phone. That's forbidden nowadays because I follow the millennial rule of never picking up my phone. So, but no, seriously, if you need to, we need to talk on the phone, that's fine, or Skype or Zoom, anything is fine. But the quickest response is through text. We'll meet, Monday, 6 o'clock. Again, I'm going to try to finish us up by 9:30 somewhere in that corridor. Some weeks will take a little longer than others, but I realize that you don't have forever to stay online, so we'll keep it as short as possible. As I said, office hours are usually not necessary, but whenever you have that quick question, just send me a text or an email and I'll get right back to you as soon as I can. Obviously, things are crazy. you might have seen that announcement today with the school closure. You know, I will get into that a little bit. I don't want to waste class time on that, but I'll address that at some point. So things are getting exponentially crazier. So what that means is, you know, I'm a little more busy than I usually am. But doesn't mean I won't get back to you as soon as I can. Okay, so I already said everything that you need is on Moodle, and I'll leave it at that. Now let's go over the materials. And again, I realize that some of these materials may take longer to get to you because of everything that's going on. But the most important, actually, the two books, I shouldn't say most important, they're both important. But there's really three things you could order, two of which are kind of mandatory. This is the first one. This is the Instant Economist. Really, really good book. What I tried to do for this course was not bog you down with heavy textbooks that are, you know, just boring to read. And believe me, economics textbooks and stats textbooks can be boring, very boring. But this particular book, this Instant Economist, reads like a magazine. It's like the kind of thing you read on the beach and have a lot of fun with. It's really thought-provoking, and it doesn't feel at all like a text. So if you get a hold of nothing else in this course, I would get that one. You know, again, I can't regulate what you do with your textbooks, but I know some of you buy them and some of you don't. That book is, I mean, I'm going to say this a million times tonight because everything going on. Economics is super important right now. And everything that's going on with the pandemic and everything. Well, it was always important, but it's even more important now. And so this book is just a super relevant read. And you could literally read this book in maybe 3 hours if you wanted to. That's how quickly it reads. Okay, so that's the first. The second one, I don't have the right edition, but it's, you know, the stats book, stats for people who hate stats. It's a funny book. You know, the other book, the economics book, is not funny, but it's informative. This one is funny and informative. And again, my goal was don't give you a textbook that's heavy reading that's going to bog you down and that you're just going to not even read because it's so boring and pointless. This one is a fun read, and it delivers the points nicely. And you know, if you're math phobic, you'll still like it. And that's, you know, that's the title of the book, right? For people who hate statistics. So I would, you know, again, I wouldn't skip out on either one of those. I can't regulate what you do, but given the choice or not, I'm telling you to get those two textbooks because they go nicely hand in hand with everything we're going to do. The third one is optional. This one is very academic, so it you know, gets into that boring territory pretty quickly. But if you want to become an economist, you know, that's the kind of thing you want to read up on anyway. Here we're looking at economics and statistics from a management application standpoint. So it's not as important that you know every last bit and nook and cranny of these subjects. It's just the ones that we think are most relevant for business. So if you want to go beyond the basics, that's your book. I would say don't get it, but some people want to, you know, take that route. That's fine. So that's it. That's all you need. Those first two books, and then obviously you have to be able to use Moodle, and then maybe some Excel. Excel is the most important program actually for this course. PowerPoint everybody has, and then you're reading the syllabus on Word, so obviously you need that. So any questions there on the materials? Okay. By the way, if you don't know, there's a raise your hand function on the, you know, wherever your control panel is. It's in different places for different people. So when you go to the more ... because I'm going to be looking at my screen and doing a million things. I can't necessarily see when you have questions. And then the other thing I'm going to do is turn on, the chat should be on. So if I'm not grabbing your question through the raise your hand function, I should be able to do it through chat. So I just turned on the chat, and that should be available to you. But again, my mind's in a million different places, so forgive me if I don't get it immediately. Okay, good. Now, as far as getting in touch with me, which, as I said before, shouldn't have to happen all that much. The best thing to do is text me. You've got my number up here. As far as me getting in touch with everybody, which I do all at once through an announcement on Moodle. I'm picking Moodle because emails have been a complete disaster. We just did this thing here, our OIT folks where they're screening out more emails because of viruses and all that kind of thing. So now I can't even send a basic email to people unless it's an NDNU address. Okay, so I'm just not even going to send any emails anymore. If any announcement that's going to happen is going to happen on Moodle. So, basically, if you don't know already, at the top of the course, there's an announcement, and let's just click on it to show you. Why is it not going? Okay, there it goes. There's already been 2 announcements. One, I gave you the details for joining today, and then I gave you another update. I'm just clicking on that one here. A couple days ago. So that anything that I need to communicate to the class at once is going to happen there. Don't expect to see it on email, because it's just easier to do it that way. And that way also you have everything in one place, so you can just scan down the list of announcements in case you have any questions about anything. But the need for announcements is going to be really minimal. I can guarantee you that. Okay, so back to the syllabus. So yeah, text me for a quicker response. I'll email you. I'm sorry, I will message you on Moodle. And then there's everything in between that you can do if you want. Okay, so the course itself, 3 major subjects, and then a little bit.
Jordan,
Yes.
I'm not able to see your screen. I don't know what I did.
Everybody else see my screen?
Mm-hmm.
Huh. Anybody know why she might not be able to see my screen? You see.
Check up at the top for view options, and it should say view Jordan's screen.
View options.
Do you see that on the top, Tina?
No, I don't.
You may have to move your mouse toward the top of the screen.
You know what? If it persists, maybe sometimes the best thing to do is log off and log back on.
Right.
Okay, maybe I'll do that.
Yeah.
Sorry, guys.
Try that first.
Okay.
Okay. We'll give you 30 seconds here. You leaving the meeting, coming back in?
Yep, that did it.
That's
Thank
it?
you.
Okay.
Sorry.
Now you know the solution to that. Okay, so the course itself, just a bit of history. It used to be the case that you had to take 4 prerequisite courses for the MBA, which were micro, macro, stats, and accounting. We took a look at that and said that's a stupid idea. It drove everybody crazy. On the administrative side, it drove us crazy. So we said, let's just put it right into the curriculum, and that's what this course is. The only exception there is we don't do accounting, which you're going to do in your management accounting course if you haven't done it already. So 3 subjects: microeconomics, macroeconomics, statistics, all taught in one course. And it sounds like a crazy idea, but we had our guinea pig sample last term, and it went really, really well. Everybody said they learned a lot, and they didn't feel pressured and like they were learning too much and not too much work. So the idea is good. And that's what you're getting. 3 courses in one, but the highlights from each of the subjects, not the deep study of each of the subjects. And of course, anything that's managerially relevant is what we're teaching. Okay, so theoretically, you would take this as your first or second course, but I know half of you that's not the case, and that's fine. But the preference is, do it sooner rather than later. Okay, so the next part, 135 hours, just ignore it. That's something we put in our syllabi for accreditation purposes. It takes you however long it takes you. That's your business. I don't care. Just get the work done, and I'm happy. Also, these approximate hours for the reading. It's just so stupid that they make us do it. But we have to do it. Okay. About 3/4 of what we're going to do is just me kind of lecturing on the concepts. I'm on course overview now, which is not my usual MO. Usually in my courses, it's like a half and half arrangement where I'm spending some of the time speaking and then you're taking the other half of the class into your own hands and doing the presenting or the interacting. But this one's a little different because it's just basically knowledge. It's just, here's the subject, here are all the concepts and the paradigms, and let's kind of get that out there. So don't think that this is a typical class for the rest of your program. Half of you already know that because you've been in other classes. So that's all I'll say there. We do have one component where we want you to participate. First thing is you're welcome to participate at all times. Questions, comments, it's all good. I want this to be as interactive as possible. Let's use the Zoom, do that. Even as we get used to it, it might be a little harder at the beginning. But there's one part of the course that's more formalized, and I'll get into that. It's called the roundtable. So let's put that on the back burner for just a second, but that's kind of more formalized participation, which is point number 2, in-class discussions. And then I don't do much in the way of activities in this course, so 3 is not terribly relevant. Now, as far as what I'm going to present every week, I mix it up. So we will do kind of about 50% economics concepts, and then the other half is going to be statistics. So, if you don't like one but you like the other, then you're kind of half in luck and half out of luck. I don't know what else to say, but at least we mix it up, and you'll get a little bit of variety. So we're not always talking about just economics or just statistics. Let's see. Moving down on the line here, attendance, again, in this all bets are off in this crazy world now. So just try to make it 6 out of 7 times. But if you don't, then you don't. I'm not going to worry about that at this time. Okay, course goals and outcomes. So really 3 things. One is, do you understand the basic models and concepts and principles of micro, macro, and statistics? And again, we're keeping it very basic because we don't have time to get fancy. We're only focusing on what we think is managerially relevant. Point number 2 that you might not have expected was we're going to do a little bit in the way of case study methodology. How do you do a case study? Because not everybody knows. And even if you've taken a few classes, you can still benefit, and done cases, you can still benefit from some of that. We'll do that at the end, and it's a pretty simple exercise, but it develops some of your skills in case study analysis. And then the other goal of this course is, you're taking other courses, it's going to draw on some of the concepts. Finance in particular draws on a lot of concepts from macroeconomics and microeconomics. Marketing is the same story, more on the micro side. Finance, again, takes a lot from statistics. In other words, you're looking at portfolio returns, the standard deviations, so you need to know these things. So part of what we do is just kind of to round out your education. The other part of what we do is literally to make sure that you're ready for future courses. Hopefully, you're taking them in sequence, but I know some of you aren't. Okay. Now, here's one of the first things that starts to get modified. The grading, the reason it's not exactly as it's shown is because we're not going to have you take exams. Yay! Those are eliminated, okay, because of all the craziness. So really all you're responsible for are the first thing here, the weekly roundtable, and then the homework assignments. We're going to make the homework assignments worth 75% because it's going to be in lieu of the exam. So 75% homework, 25% roundtable, and that's your grade, okay? So that's all you got to worry about. And then, if you're participating and adding value, we'll kick your grade up a notch. But, I'm going to try to give all you A's. Seriously, I really don't want you to worry about it because you have bigger and better fish to fry right now. Okay. So that's grading. And then let's talk about the assignments themselves. So yeah, the first one is the text roundtable discussions. And this is my attempt to make the course as formally interactive as I can, and to also make sure that you're keeping up on the reading, or at the very least engage with the concepts of the course. Because again, I know some of you get the books and some of you don't, and I can't twist your arm. But the idea is come prepared starting next week, because this is our first week. Next week, come prepared to discuss one topic that stood out to you in the reading. Okay, I don't care if it's from the econ text or the stats text or the slides, but something that was, and here's my list here, I'm reading the syllabus verbatim. It's either important, useful, confusing, noteworthy, intriguing, surprising, debatable, or some combination thereof. Okay, now, coronavirus, maybe you have some thoughts on that as it relates to the economics material, the stats, and there's plenty of applications there, boundless applications. Okay, so we could throw that into the mix. I don't want to talk about it every minute of the day because we probably need some diversions from that, but if you want to, that's great. But it's just one point, write it down or keep it in your head. I don't care, but we'll kind of break somewhere in the middle, and then we'll fire off 2 or 3 of these thoughts at a time. So we'll go to person number 1. What's your thought of the week? Person number, we'll discuss it a little bit, and then person number 2. I like to usually do them in groups of 3 to kind of mix things up, and then we do some more lecture, and then we come back to another 2 or 3 thoughts, and then it's just a nice kind of arrangement there. So you'll kind of get the hang of it. And again, there's really no other directive other than just pick something that fits one of those requirements, and it's up to you. And the whole point is just let's discuss things as opposed to me lecturing you ad nauseum, and then bring in some interesting ideas and keep the discussion lively. Okay, the next point doesn't matter because there's no exams, so it's just every week, just be prepared to discuss something. By the way, we're only gonna meet 6 times, 6, because we started late. We have to finish the semester on time, and because we're taking out exams, that would have consumed 2 classes, one class worth, because the exams are 2 hours each, so 2 + 2 is 4. So we'll only need to meet 6 times, and that's what I scheduled on Zoom, as opposed to the usual 7. Okay, so weekly homework assignments. This is the bulk of your work. Let me literally show you these on Moodle. So you see here, you have the microeconomics homework assignments. Here you have the macroeconomics homework assignments, and then you have the statistics assignments. It looks like a lot, and I will admit it's a lot, but some of these, like the very first one, I'll just click on it, the economic mindset. That one's only 8 questions, okay? So that's gonna take you all of 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes, okay? So the first thing I want you to know is that these are all varying lengths. So for instance, supply and demand, I think it's like, let's go to it. I think it's like 60 problems, preview that guy. Yeah, that 61. So, some will seem like a lot, others will seem like a breeze, and then there's everything in between. And the other thing is I don't care when you do them, because especially since we're not having exams, there's no point in making you rush to get them done every week if you don't have the time. So you work at your own pace. Obviously, the smartest thing to do is to do the problems as soon after the lecture, i.e. tonight, as possible, so that the material's fresh in your mind, okay? But if you don't want to do that, you want to put them off for 2-3 weeks, that's fine. It's up to you. I don't care. But it's preferable that you try to stay in lockstep with the lectures. All right, sorry, I'm just rearranging things here a little bit. I have too many files open. Okay. So back to the syllabus homework. I think that's all I need to say there. Is just do, they're all multiple choice questions. That's the other thing. So there's no essays. It's just very straightforward. And the best place to find information for getting the homework problems done is the slides. The questions come right from the slides, and they involve everything that we talk about. So you're going to see it's very tightly woven together. Okay, exams, not relevant. Skip it. Who cares? Okay. This is other information you can read. It's on every one of your syllabi, so you've probably seen it a million times already. I'm going to skip all this. Academic honesty. If you want to work together and do the homework together, great. That's fine. I don't, with everybody's schedules being crazy, I don't know that if that's going to happen. But consult with each other, consult with me. Just hand it in or submit it individually. That's all I ask. And then here you have the tentative schedule, which we pretty much do stick to. I might not cover every single one of these topics tonight, but it's going to be most of them. And so this tells you what to read in Taylor and what to read in Salkind for this week. When we do the roundtable next week, I don't care which chapters you pull your idea from. It can be from these chapters from this week, or it can be from the chapters next week. What you don't want to do is, skip down to week 4 and pull a topic out of there, because that wouldn't make sense. So just pick something that we're kind of sort of working on currently. Let that be your focus. Okay, so I'm talking a lot. Any questions or thoughts? Yes, Serena.
Do you already have the slides posted, or will you post them the week of?
Yes. Let me show you exactly where they are. Yes, I do, and they're already posted. And the slides, everything's in course materials.
Okay.
So, yeah, microeconomics. Click on it. You got all the files there that we're going to use tonight. All right. We are set up for you. Anything else?
Nope.
Good. No? Okay. All right, so I think I'm done with the syllabus. Any, when the questions come up, just ask. And after a week of this course, you're going to have this down. It's not hard. All right, time to get right into the material. I'm going to pull up the first slide, which is economic mindset. I should make sure my chat is showing here, because it's not showing. Chat. Okay, just in case anybody wants to do chat. All right, so here we go with kind of an introduction. This is, oops. Actually, they told me not to do the slideshow, just to present the slides like this so you can see where I'm going on the left here. So that's what I'm going to do. Okay, so what economics is all about at a fundamental level is trying to answer these 3 questions, which, if you look around with everything, actually, let me just do one thing here. Sorry, I need to start recording, which I didn't do before. Oh, it is recording. It says, okay, great. So economics is about answering these 3 basic questions, which is, what do I produce, how do I produce it, who gets to consume what is produced, which seem like very simple questions, but are not simple questions because of the variety of desires that we have, and then things change over time. Just look at the toilet paper situation, which everybody's familiar with. And then there's the idea of what kind of government do we have, and what philosophically do we agree with as a means of production. And so that kind of leads me into the next slide, which is the foundations of economic thought, starting with how governments manage economies. Okay, at the 2 opposite ends of the spectrum, and of course we've seen this in the election cycle here with Bernie versus Biden versus Trump. So we'll talk a lot about politics too. If that's your thing, you're gonna like that. At one end of the spectrum, you have capitalism, where people, consumers, and firms jointly decide what gets produced and who gets to consume it. Okay. Whereas at the other end of the spectrum, socialism, which of course is a nasty word, and it shouldn't be, because at its fundamental core, basically it's just saying that the government decides what gets produced and who gets to consume it, which sometimes is what needs to happen. It's what's happening now with the pandemic. So, but in our country, socialism is equated with communism, and communism was always a bad thing because it was the Russians and the Cold War, and so it's not popular to say that you're socialistic, or you're going to run an economy as a socialistic economy. But anyway, fundamentally, that's what you're talking about, is who controls production and who controls consumption, essentially. Okay, so, and that gets into the second bullet there, which is the issue of, do we have individual freedoms if the government is telling us what needs to be produced and what needs to be consumed? And most people would say no. And so therefore, we tend to favor, at least in this country, capitalism, because the consumer is king, and the consumer decides what gets produced and what gets consumed. And so therefore, you get to pick and choose your consumption. Okay. So now economics or economists don't always think necessarily that capitalism is the best solution. Even though, again, we here in America and other democratic societies around the world tend to think capitalism is king and the best solution of how you run an economy. Look at what happens when businesses take advantage, right? And they pump consumers for all the money they can get out of them. They give you shoddy product, low quality, and they charge you an arm and a leg for it. There's shortages now. One of the things that should be happening is, just to give you a quick example, the supermarkets should be regulated because people go in there and they hoard supplies, right? I'm sure you've all had that problem lately. So why aren't the government stepping in and saying to the supermarkets, stop the hoarding and put in mechanisms to stop it? They're leaving it still to the producers, who are the supermarkets, to make those decisions, but some would argue that's a bad idea. So just as one example, capitalism is not necessarily a good idea all the time, even though we tend to like it. There are situations in which socialism or some in between is actually superior. Okay, now, point number 2, economists make predictions all the time. They predict things like gross domestic product, they predict unemployment. That's going on a lot now, right? What's the unemployment rate going to be? 20%, maybe 30%, who knows? Economists are notorious for making horrible, horrible predictions, okay? And they get paid a lot of money to make these predictions. So something is way out of whack. I can't explain it, but I don't make the rules. What I do know is it's very hard to predict the future because, again, who would have predicted coronavirus a year ago? Who would have predicted, economic recession a year ago? People were saying a year ago, there's not going to be a recession because things are doing so well. So anyway, I want you to understand, economists make predictions. Usually they're wrong. Sometimes they're right. Have we been getting better at predicting over the years? Yes. Why is that? Because the models we use, the statistics we use, the software has literally gotten better. And so that's a whole, you could do a PhD on that if you wanted to. But just the simple idea is the tools are out there that are better now to get the job done of prediction. So you're taking some of that out of people's hands and putting it into the software, and that's why it's gotten better. But we're still bad as economists, and so therefore you should usually look very skeptically upon all these predictions made by economists. Okay, number 3 bullet point, scarcity. Very basic concept in economics that says we have very limited resources. Again, the toilet paper example, but at any other time in history, there's always limited resources for everything. Water was starting to become an issue in a lot of places, especially here in California because of the drought, right? We all know that. So scarcity just says you have to make the best use of your resources that you have, and there are limited resources. And so therefore, what economists focus on is trying to deal with that scarcity and still make consumers and societies as well off as possible, given the fact that there's going to be scarcity for resources. Which leads to the next point, which is trade-offs and opportunity costs. Trade-offs arise because you have scarcity. So I think most of you are in Tracy. You're living in or near Tracy. And maybe some of you even commute to San Francisco or somewhere near the city. And the trade-off that you make is you probably save somewhat in housing costs and cost of living, although I know Tracy's still not cheap to live in, or the Triangle's not cheap, but it's still cheaper than living in San Francisco. But the trade-off that you make is you save some money, but then you have to have a bigger commute. And is there a workaround? Yeah, well, maybe you can work remotely, especially with everything now, you have to almost. So the point is, one simple example is commuting is a perfect example of trading off, where you're giving up one thing to get another. Okay, you save on living costs, but then you have to have a bigger commute, traditionally speaking. But we trade off everything. You get more of one thing, you get less of something else. You pay more money, you get better service, you get better product, but you spent more money. So now you have less savings. Okay, that's a trade-off right there. So economics realizes that there are tons of trade-offs, and it focuses on these trade-offs that consumers make. Related to that is the idea of opportunity cost. The opportunity cost is the value of the thing that you gave up. The classic example of this was always when you go to college full-time. If you're a traditional college student, none of you are, you're all working full-time and doing this on the side. But when you were back in college, probably what you did is you went to college full time, which means you couldn't take a job full time. So whatever that job would have paid you, let's say it was $70,000, whatever, that's the opportunity cost of you going to school, is the job that you didn't get income from. And so this is another subset of trade-offs. Is when you do one thing, you can't do another because we have limited resources, limited abilities, time, biology, whatever the constraint is. You can't do everything. So societies can't do everything, and so they trade things off. And the thing that they don't do, the value of that is the opportunity cost. So that's going to come back a lot of times when we talk about economic concepts. Now, the next two go together, rational self-interest and Adam Smith's invisible hand. Adam Smith was a British economist who created this notion. I mean, wasn't the first probably ever to do it, but he's the one who coined the phrase of invisible hand or self-interest. They basically mean the same thing. And what self-interest is the idea that people make decisions, act as if they are doing things for themselves. They don't care about other people, which I know sounds cold-hearted and totally unaltruistic, but Adam Smith basically said that's the way people act, whether they want to admit it or not. So when you buy anything in the supermarket, especially nowadays, you're doing it for yourself. When you choose this job versus this other one, you're not worrying about everybody else's problems. You're worrying about your own mostly, okay? And Adam Smith said that this is a good thing. It's not a bad thing to be selfish because that's what drives markets, is rational self-interest, okay? But then what happened, just to give you a brief forward of that history, is we found out people don't always act in their own self-interest. People sometimes defer their own interests, especially in voting. We talk about politics, and who you vote for is not always who you should be voting for, and you do it because irrationalities creep into your mind and get you to do things that are not in your best self-interest. A lot of that, comes from advertising or the way things are framed or just situational influences. So that's a whole topic we could do a course on in consumer psychology. But the main point is, from an economic standpoint, Adam Smith said, you do what's best for you. Don't worry about the other guy's needs, unless worrying about somebody else's needs actually helps you do better for yourself. And that's why we do trade and exchange, and pretty much every product out there, you're worrying about somebody else's needs, not just your own. So, but Adam Smith would say it's still in your own self-interest, your own best interest, to worry about other people's interests. And that's where it ends. The buck ends there. So the idea then of an invisible hand is, the invisible hand is what drives markets to set prices and produce certain products or not produce them. It's this self-interest in the background that's making companies make things. And that's the invisible hand, because it's just somebody that's kind of like God running the world, right? The invisible hand, according to Smith, is kind of like God, if you will, and that's what drives things in terms of economics. Okay, so the last part is then prices. We're going to talk a lot about pricing, especially tonight. How do prices get set? And the basic idea is that a price gets set through interactions in markets. So in other words, let's say you're selling your car, your old beat up car, you want to get rid of it. You go online, maybe you post your car online, and maybe it's on eBay or whatever, and you set a price, okay? And maybe the price is too high, so nobody buys it. So then you lower the price a little bit, and maybe you get some takers, maybe you get some interest, maybe you don't. But the point is, you can't just dictate a price in most cases. The price is set by the market, which is the interaction of producers and consumers, okay? And the market will respond to prices that make sense and will ignore or will push up or down prices that don't make sense. So we're going to get into a lot of that tonight with supply and demand. But individuals do not ultimately set prices. It's the market that ultimately sets prices, not individuals. So I love this quote from Adam Smith, who said, I'll read it word for word, "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard for their own interest." That's the rational self-interest idea, and that's a cute way to phrase it. And again, the rational self-interest is the invisible hand that drives the market. Okay, so what we're doing here is we're laying out a lot of different fundamental concepts that circulate throughout economics, the next of which is division of labor or specialization. The two basically mean the same thing. And the basic idea is if you're good at something, that's what you should do. If you're better at something than somebody else, that's what you should do. If somebody else is better at something than you, then let them do it. Okay, because what you want is the highest quality product for the lowest price. And the way that happens fundamentally is you have specialization. So what you find then is that if you have a higher income economy like the US, like Canada, like most of Europe, like most of Asia, like some parts of Latin America, but you know the higher income countries, it's pretty easy to know. You have much more division of labor in those economies, meaning much more specialization, where those who are best at the task do that task and leave the other work to other companies or people. In lower income economies, one division or one person, one company does everything. It's kind of like when you go to a restaurant and they have Chinese food and German food and American and all in one. Who wants to eat there? Nobody, right? Okay, so the point is the food's going to be worse because there's basically no division of labor, and so the same applies to pretty much any product. And that's why the whole outsourcing industry has been burgeoning for the last 20 to 30 years. Is we send it off to those who can do it the cheapest and sometimes the best quality, but not always. A lot of times it's about price, but the fundamental requirement might just be the price. Who can produce it at the lowest price, because we don't necessarily care about the quality because the consumers aren't demanding the higher quality. Okay, so what you tend to find again in higher income economies, higher GDP economies, is more division of labor, more specialization, less specialization. And my third bullet point here, specialization applies to everyone, for everything. People, right? Most people have one career, they do one thing, and they try to get really good at that. They don't have, hopefully, 5 different jobs in 5 different fields. Firms, same idea. Regions and countries, geographies, right? So talk about cars. Who's got better cars, America or Japan? Japan still, most people would probably say, because they've done more specialization in cars. Wine, you might debate now. We might say Napa is just as good as parts of France, the Loire Valley. But for the longest time, everybody thought France had the best wines because that's something they specialized in. Okay, so countries, regions, places, people, firms specialize. And then there's an added complication to all this. That's my next bullet point. Because let's come back to cars specifically. Where is your car made? Well, if it's a Japanese car, just as an example, Toyota, part of it might be made in Japan. The other part might be made in America. Other pieces of it might be made in South America. Who knows? But the point is, the car is a conglomeration of parts from all around the world. So where is the car made? I don't know. It's a really complicated question to answer because there's too many parts in the final product, and they're each made at a different place. And so then you can get into theories about, okay, well, where it's actually put together, that's the place. But, well, I don't know if that's necessarily true. You have to kind of take this all with a grain of salt, because who's making any given product nowadays may be spread out all across, and it probably is spread out all across the world. But the point is, the individual pieces of it are still specialized. They're still made in a certain place that does it better than anybody else. Or at least there's the top 3 or something like that make it. And that's where we get our parts from. Okay. Now, the whole reason we like specialization, other than higher productivity and economies of scale, is it promotes trade. And as we're going to argue later on in the course when we get to the international part, trade really winds up benefiting more than hurting. And again, some of you, if you have different philosophical orientations, this comes down to politics and philosophy and maybe even religion, but there are some people in the world that think trade is not good, okay, because it takes away jobs and because it It decimates opportunities for local firms to sell. So we'll get into that, but the research would say, just preliminarily to introduce the topic, trade is more optimal than not trading, okay? And so therefore, if we want to trade, we have to have specialization, and the specialization or division of labor creates conditions for trade. I like this quote by Michael Caine. If you've ever seen the movie The Weatherman, great movie, incidentally. Now that we have a lot of time to watch movies at home, rent this one. But he says, in this shit life, we must chuck some things. And he's talking about specialization or division of labor. You can't do everything. You can't be good at everything. And that's a basic principle of economics. Okay, so we've kind of gotten into this when we talked about the difference between capitalism and socialism. And we said in capitalism, who decides what's made is really a joint process between consumers and firms. But ultimately, who does the production and signs the checks and signs the contracts is the firm. So you could even simplify it more and say firms are the ones making the production decisions. But I never saw a firm that just makes things and says, you know what, the consumer will buy it and they'll come around. You know, most firms consult with consumers in one way or another to make these production decisions, whether it's through focus groups or surveys or just, you know, plain old phone, email interactions, whatever. There's some joint process. Okay, so it's at the one end of the spectrum, you could say firms. The other end of the spectrum, you could say joint process between firms and consumers. And then the question I have below is kind of philosophical. It says, are there any exceptions to the rule that firms have to produce what people want and need? And so one answer I gave you to that was, you know, socialist economies, that doesn't tend to happen that much, okay? Or as much as it would in a capitalist economy. Anybody have any thoughts there? Any exceptions? Shout it out. Nothing? Okay. Well, did you ever see the movie Field? I think it's called Field of Dreams. Kevin Costner, baseball movie. They build the baseball field in the backyard, cornfield. Okay. Well, anyway, in that movie, there was a famous line that says, "If you build it, they will come." Okay. So there are certain marketers in this world who believe that they don't need to consult with consumers. They can just produce anything they want. And if they do a good enough job of it, people will come around to realize what they need. And what they need is what that firm is actually producing. Okay, so you look at a company like Apple Computers, who obviously has done very, very well over the years, although they were almost bankrupt at one point, by the way. And they don't do a lot of research with consumers, believe it or not. They really basically only talk to their employees who are users of the product. And they say to them, what is it that you want and need in these kinds of products that we make? And that's how they make their decisions. So there is a school of thought out there that the consumer basically doesn't know what they want or need, and firms can figure that out before the consumer figures it out and produce accordingly. And sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. I mean, Apple's had plenty of product failures. Just think about the Newton, if you remember that one. That was way before we had any, cell phones and smartphones. Apple came out with this Newton, which was the precursor to all that, and it just fell flat on its face. Nobody bought it. Partially because there just wasn't enough need for it in terms of the things that it could do. But it was, ideas, by the way, this is a piece of business advice. Ideas recycle. Don't discount old ideas that fail. They could come back at a later time and then work, like in the case of the Newton. Okay, so I'm just kind of cluing you into the one exception here, which is that consumers don't always know everything, and they don't always know what they want and need till they see it. And so therefore, that's, I think, the one major exception besides socialism, which dictates what the consumer is going to have for the most part. Okay, more concepts here. And we're almost done with the introductory stuff. Marginal cost and benefit, crucially important. I can't estimate this enough. You're going to see this, I don't know, about 100 million times in the next 6 weeks. When you hear the word marginal, It means the next thing that you do. Okay, another fancy word for that is incremental. So that's kind of the overall idea of marginal. What's your next move? Now, when you make a next move, which could be buying something, consuming something, that's usually the two major things. There's a cost with doing that, and there's a benefit with doing that. So if you go out and you buy a bottle of water, then your marginal cost for buying that bottle of water in the next 10 minutes would be $1.50 or whatever you pay. Okay, simple. The benefit of drinking that water is whatever the benefit is. You're not thirsty anymore. You've got fluids in your system, whatever. What benefit you want to make it into. But both of those can usually be quantified. And there are all sorts of ways we go about quantifying benefits, which we won't get into in this course. We're just going to tell you what the benefit is because it's not, the quantification is not the important part. But everything you do or don't do has a marginal cost and a marginal benefit associated with it. And it's the cost and benefit of doing the next thing that you're about to do, whether it's producing more, purchasing more, consuming more, etc. Now, the rule in economics is you will keep taking action as long as the marginal benefit exceeds the marginal cost, okay? So I'm gonna actually go down to the last bullet point here and give you a quick example. When you go out and you buy a product, sometimes if the product is big enough and it costs enough, you're going to do some research, so you're looking at homes or computers or a phone. You don't just go out and buy one most of the time. You do your homework, right? So what is your homework? You go online, you read reviews, you talk to your friends and family, maybe you try out the product, you self-drive the car, you test drive the car at the dealership before you buy it. But the point is, whatever those activities are, that's cost. It costs you in terms of time. It costs you in terms of aggravation. I mean, I hate going shopping. I'm the world's worst shopper, okay? Especially nowadays. Waiting on lines, forget it. But because I know the cost, and I want to deploy my time elsewhere, not in the supermarket, and that's why I order things online, right? That's why you do it too. But online ordering has a cost too. You got to wait, usually. So whatever those costs are, you incur those costs as you're searching for information, and then you get to a point where you say, you know what, I'm not learning anything new. Okay, the benefit of information search is you gather information. You learn about price, you learn about product quality, you learn about what people are saying about the product, you learn about how people are using the product. It's a whole host of things you learn. But the point is, those are informational benefits. But the more search you do, you start to realize I'm not learning that much anymore, but I'm spending time on this website, going to stores, whatever. So then you stop, okay? So you stop at the point at which the marginal cost starting to exceed the marginal benefit. And that's the rule down here, is when you have marginal benefit, marginal cost greater than zero, the difference between the two, you have what's called a marginal surplus, and you keep doing whatever you were doing before. When you have the exact opposite, where your marginal cost is exceeding your marginal benefit, therefore the difference between the two is negative, then you've got a marginal loss, and you wouldn't even do that to the extent that you knew that was happening. Sometimes you don't know, okay? But what happens, though, is if consumers know any better and they're acting rationally in their own rational self-interest, you continue the activity until the point at which marginal benefit equals marginal cost. At that point where MB equals MC, you are done doing whatever you were doing before, consuming, purchasing, producing, whatever. That's a big concept in economics. You're going to see that reverberate again and again throughout the course. Do anything until MB equals MC. If you do that, then you do this thing called maximizing total surplus. And we're going to get into that later today, so just hold that thought. Now, this is the first of many graphs you're going to see in the course, and I will tell you right off the bat, economists love these things because they let you illustrate a certain situation, an economic situation, and how consumers are reacting to it or firms are reacting to it. So this is going to be the first of many. At some point, these can start. Oops, my Siri went off as we were talking. at some point, these can get very complicated, and they get hard to look at. So I will point that out. It's not probably till next week where that happens. The first ones you'll see are much simpler. But economists use these all the time to explain how an economy is working, consumers are doing their decisions, etc. So this is the first of many. Okay, so what do we have here? We have two curves. One is called the marginal cost curve. The other is called the marginal benefit curve, abbreviated MC and MB. And what you notice is on the x-axis, you have action units. Okay, in other words, how many things are we doing? Here it's 10, here it's 20, here it's 30. What are we doing? I don't know. It doesn't matter, because the point is it's a generic case. It can apply to consumption, purchasing, production, whatever. Okay, but it's some activity, and we're quantifying it on the x-axis. The more to the right we go, the more activity we have. And then on the vertical axis is the benefit. I'm sorry, the dollar, or the value, but it's in, I'll just say it's in dollars, because that's what the title says. But the dollar value of doing that activity. So for instance, at 10 units of activity, what do we see? We see that the marginal cost is 20 bucks. And then if we go up to the benefit curve, it's $60 worth of benefit. So what I can say then is that at 10 units of activity, I have a marginal benefit of 60, a marginal cost of 20. Therefore, my marginal surplus is 60 minus 20, or 40. Okay. And what you find is that as you go further and further to the right, let's take another example here at 20. The marginal cost is 30, the marginal benefit is 50. So that's a difference of 20. My marginal surplus here is 20, whereas over here it was, what did we say, 40. So as you're getting closer to this very important point here where the two curves intersect, that difference is getting less and less and less, until you get right here at this equilibrium point where the marginal benefit equals the marginal cost and the surplus is zero, nothing. So what does it mean? It means we can predict the consumer will engage in 30 units of activity and no more and no less if he or she is being rational. The underlying assumption is always rationality. Are consumers irrational? Yes, I said that before millions of times. Okay, but when they're acting rationally, which they're doing about 80% of the time, if you want a number, 80% of the time they will engage in 30 units of activity, and they will maximize their surplus by doing that. Because if they did 20 units of activity, they would be giving up some of that surplus. If they did 10 units, they're giving up even more, because they're missing out on all these additional consumptions that will yield some surplus. Okay, so the main message is you have two curves, marginal cost, marginal benefit. They intersect at a point. That's the point at which the consumption or activity happens. If the consumer is being rational, in this case, 30 units of activity, and that maximizes their surplus. Okay, so I've been talking a lot. Any thoughts, questions, concerns? That was the intro. All right. Yes, Serena.
So we can apply this to, say, manufacturing?
You can.
Okay.
And in the manufacturing sense, it would be production.
Okay.
Right. And just since you asked, I'm going to kind of flesh it out a little bit. If you're a producer, what's your benefit? Your benefit is how much money you make on the sale of product. If you're a producer, what's your cost? It's the cost of production. Okay. So that's the way these curves would then kind of be set up, is to look at revenue here and then cost here of production, and they would produce at 30 units. So yes, absolutely.
Oh, the reason why I say that is because we just came out of the Global Operations Management class, and when we learned about lean production, it was really about maximizing all resources for and making it in line with the consumer demand.
Right. So hold that thought. We're going to get into some very complex models that take into account everything that you just said.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hey, Jordan?
Yes.
So I could see where a company could calculate, what their marginal cost is, but how do you calculate the benefit? I mean, I see how the cost curve can be calculated, but I don't see how one calculates a benefit curve.
So two things to say there. One is, what context are we talking about? So let's answer that question first. Did you have a specific context? Was it the firm?
Well, no, I'm saying if we're going to go out and look at, you used the example earlier of looking at a car.
Yeah.
How would you figure out what the benefit is of the 10 times I go out or the 10 pieces of information I look at to determine if the car is worthwhile?
So in that particular example, you can literally ask consumers the value of knowing some piece of information versus not knowing it.
Okay.
So for instance, if we're looking for a car, what's the value of knowing how well the car handles? What's the value of test driving the car? What's the value of knowing the mileage? Okay. And the way you do it is very complicated. I won't get into that, but that's when you talk to a marketing researcher and they have all these tools to do that. But let's just say, for the sake of simplicity, there are survey methodologies that get at having consumers parse out that value.
Okay.
And basically, we steal it from their mind. We don't ask them, what's the value. We kind of cajole them into admitting
Okay.
it.
So I guess that was it. I was looking for some solid method for calculating it.
Yeah, no, it depends on what you're trying to do. I mean, there's different. So look, if you've taken marketing, if you've taken my marketing course for sure, you talked about conjoint analysis. Conjoint analysis is the single most popular way to ferret out those values.
Okay.
And what it does, just briefly for everybody's edification here, it basically makes consumers make trade-offs between things, and it has them value those trade-offs. So what adding that thing into the car, the global navigation system. Okay, well, if you want that, what are you willing to pay for it? So we can ferret that out through conjoint.
Okay. As
a brief answer. But yeah, it's not that easy. It's not that easy, but it can be done, and there are tools and methodologies like conjoint to do that. The other thing I want to say is some of this is very theoretical. Okay, we're just describing from a very high level how people act and societies act, and so therefore it's not even worth answering the question of how you actually measure it in real life, which I know sounds like contrary to the whole point of this course, which is what's the managerial application. But I do understand that economists just use this as a vocabulary sometimes to have a conversation about the way people are behaving without actually quantifying. So that's part two to your answer, which is a great question. Okay, any other thoughts here on the intro? Okay, great. I'm going to go to supply and demand now, our second set of slides. And this is where the rubber really starts hitting the road. Let's start talking about markets. What the heck is a market? Because we're going to use this word about 1 million times. It's a market is you think about the grocery store as a market. It is a market. It's a very small market because how many people are at your grocery store nowadays? Again, the virus, maybe it's too many, but normally it's like 100 people maybe are in a store at a time, right? So that's a small market, but then you have markets that are the size of the entire world or the entire United States. The term market is used very generically to just describe a bunch of buyers and sellers coming together to buy something or many things. But the way we're going to flesh out the models is we're going to talk about one product at a time, just because it's too hard to talk about 3,000 products at a time. Like when you go to Target, they sell 3,000, 4,000 different things. And so we don't have that kind of time on our hands to discuss all that. Okay, so people coming together, buyers and sellers, buyers demand product, sellers supply product, basic idea. And then we have the law of demand, which says a very simple thing. The lower the price of a product, the more people want to buy. Okay, that pretty much applies to you, applies to me, it applies to markets in general. Price influences our willingness to buy. So my example is, everybody seems to be drinking coffee these days. If we sell the same cup of coffee for $1 versus $4, when are you gonna drink more? Obviously, when it's $1. Now, I know what you're thinking. If you're selling me coffee for $1, it must be crappy coffee. So maybe I wouldn't drink it at all. Okay. And that's not what I'm saying here. I'm saying the dollar coffee is just as good. It's the same as the $4 coffee. So we're holding, in economics, you have to hold everything else constant so you can talk about the thing that you want to talk about. So same coffee sold at $1 versus $4. When are you going to drink more? If you're a coffee drinker, you're going to drink more when it's $1, of course. Very simple. Okay. Law of demand. The lower the price, the more you demand. That leads to the idea of substitution effect. A substitution, you know what substitutions are in sports, tag team, right? One thing substitutes for another, and so this applies to products and goods and services, right? So if the price of something goes up, what do? You don't demand it as much because of the law of demand. So what do? You don't want to go hungry or productless, so you demand something else that's just as good. Okay, when the price goes up. Now, when the price goes down, you shift your demand towards the thing that's going down in price. So we're going to use chicken and what do I do here? Chicken, beef, or pork. Okay, so any kind of meat. I know you're not all meat eaters these days, but let's just assume people eat meat because they do. The price of chicken goes up and you're okay with eating beef or pork. What do? You buy more beef or pork and you buy less chicken. Okay, because you're substituting pork and beef for chicken because the price is better. My second example, Droid versus iPhone. Okay, the price of Droid phones goes down. What do? You buy more Droid phones than iPhone. And I know what you're thinking. No, I don't. Okay, because iPhones have been going up and up and up in price every year. You know, by the way, that's the ninth wonder of the world. The iPhone gets worse and worse and worse every year. Ever since Steve Jobs died, and you know now Tim Cook's running the company both. But the phone gets worse and worse and worse, and the price keeps going up and up and up, and people keep buying it. Why is that? Well, that brand loyalty, okay. And then it's also called switching costs, so that's a marketing concept. But you can argue with these proclamations that economists make because you always find counterexamples. And so, yes, you're right, but in general, and even in the case of Android and iPhones, when the price of Android phones goes down, people do switch away from iPhones that are getting more expensive. Okay, if iPhone prices go up, more people say I'm gonna think about Android as an option, even though we love iPhones for whatever reason. I don't know why. I have one. I hate it now. So it's a general tendency, but there are always exceptions. Okay, but that's the substitution effect. You go towards the cheaper good, you move away from the more expensive good. So now we introduce one of our famous curves here, the demand curve. And so let's just kind of take a quick tour of this curve before we get into the specifics. What you'll notice here on the Y or vertical axis is price. Okay, you have a price of whatever good we're talking about here. It's jeans. And so we could sell jeans at various prices, and it's just one pair of jeans, one specific pair of jeans that has a certain fit. We're not talking about all jeans because jeans are all different. Any product has millions of different kinds of configurations, right? So whatever pair of jeans it is, it doesn't matter. Here's the prices we could charge for the jeans. Here are the quantities of jeans that get demanded based on the prices we charge on this axis. So to take one quick example, let's look at point A. At point A, if we're charging the price of $60, just trace it out to the price. $60 is the price. How many are we demanding? 300 million. Let's go to this point here, unlabeled. At a price of $40, how many are we demanding? 400 million. So you notice as the price goes down, I go from $60 to $40. What happened to demand? It went up. Quantity demanded goes up. That's the law of demand. The whole slope of this curve, downward slope, is a reflection of the law of demand that says as prices rise, quantities demanded go down. As prices go down, quantity demanded goes up. That's it. So you can do this tracing for any price quantity point that you want. Okay, now, one of the example here is from A to B. As I go from a price of, you can do it either way, but let's follow the arrow. As I go from a price of $60 to $80, I'm moving along this demand curve. It's called an upward move along the demand curve. And that means if I look at quantities demanded are dropping from 300,000 to 200,000. Just trace it up to the point, always. And that, again, is the law of demand. And then I can reverse it and say, what if I drop price from 80 to 60? Then demand goes from 200 to 300 million. So it can work the opposite direction too. Okay, and that's the basic idea of the demand curve and the law of demand. Now, what's actually much more practically useful in real life, and marketers work with this all the time, and this is why I made sure to include it in the course, is to put things in terms of functions. And so we start, of course, with the demand function because we're looking at demand curves. But the functions are a bunch of variables that relate, in this case, demand to some other factors. So we're going to start out with the most simplest relation, which is how much gets demanded based on the price of the good. That's what the demand curve is. So let's go through the labels. Well, here's the major equation. The labels for each of the pieces are as follows. Q to the D power, actually, I'm sorry, it's Q sub D really, is how many things are demanded. In this case, it's a jeans model, so we'll talk about the quantity demanded of jeans. And that is your x-axis, right, in the prior slide. P would be the price of jeans, and we know that there's a very firm relationship between P and Q sub D. And then this A and B wind up being numbers that just make the equation work. Okay, so this is, finding this A and B is what economists use the software to do. You're using various kinds of statistical software to generate an A and a B. And that's basically the holy grail of these kinds of analyses, is generating what are called slope coefficients. Okay, so what do we have? We have two things that I want you to understand. Dependent variables and independent variables. We've taken statistics before, hopefully not, because we're going to be doing statistics in this course. But the point is, in statistics, you talk a lot about dependent and independent variables. And in this particular case, the independent variable is price. It's independent because nothing is driving price. We're saying what happens to demand, which is dependent on price, when price starts to change all over the map, right? Like when we look back at this slide here, we were varying price all up and down the axis and seeing what happened to quantity demanded. Okay, so the phraseology is one variable depends on the other. The one that depends on the other is called the dependent variable, and demand in these models is always going to be dependent. The independent variable here in this particular simple model winds up being price, but it can wind up being other things, as we're going to show later on tonight. Okay, so that's the idea. And then if we go back to the original model, the equation, you'll notice that you have quantity demanded equals A, which is some number. You can think about A as the quantity demanded when the price is zero, but who the hell charges zero price for something nowadays? Okay, well, I don't know, again, this pandemic, it might be different, but normally, under normal situations, you're charging some price. So what the heck is the use of A? Well, A gets you the numerical answer you need. It's an intermediary number, okay? But it's literally mathematically interpreted as the quantity demanded when price is zero. So don't even worry about that if that doesn't make sense. More important is what's B. And B is basically what we're going to later on call an elasticity coefficient, but for now, it's representing the slope of this demand curve. It's basically saying what happens to the change in quantity demanded when we increase the price of the product by $1. Okay, so that's a really important number to know about. In fact, it's the most important number in this whole setup. Okay, but we'll come back to that. The question I asked here at the bottom is, why is there a negative sign next to B? And the quick answer is because it reflects the law of demand. Again, as we increase price, go up this axis, what's happening to quantity demanded? It's shrinking. It's getting less and less and less getting closer and closer to zero as we go up the price line here. So that's why it's negative. It's because it's reflecting that law of demand. Okay. All right. So I kind of got into this a second ago, but this is a really important distinction. I'm going to talk for about 10 more minutes, then we'll take a nice break. You have two major ends of the spectrum in terms of what's going on with demand that you need to understand the difference between. The first of the two is what's called moving up or down the demand curve. So we did that just a second ago. I said, okay, what happens when you go from a $60 price to an $80 price? You're going to shrink quantity demanded by 100 million units. But you're moving up and down that demand curve. Moving up or down the demand curve only has to do with price changes. That's the secret. If it's about changing the price of the product being demanded, then it's a movement up or down the demand curve. Any other factor we're going to talk about is going to be the other thing, which I'm going to introduce in about 2 seconds. Okay, so the first thing you ask yourself, so you don't drive yourself crazy, is, am I just changing the price of the product? If so, we're going to see a movement up or down the demand curve. If it's a price increase, you move up. If it's a price decrease, you move down, because that's, your prices are here, right, on the vertical axis. Okay. Now, the second part of the distinction is, do we have a change in demand, or what's otherwise known as a demand shift? So let's look at this first example on the left. We have an original demand curve, which we label D sub 0. And then you see an arrow pushing that D sub 0 curve to the right, and now we label it D sub 1. That is demand shift. That is not a movement up or down the curve like you saw over here. Something is happening that is actually changing demand, and that something is not related to price shifts. So what the heck is it related to? Let's take a look. Well, actually, before we do that, let's look at the opposite case. You can have demand moving to the left. So your original curve is here. Now it moves to the left, shifts to the left. That's a decrease in demand. When it shifts to the right, you're talking about an increase in demand. So that's another important thing you have to understand these diagrams. Rightward shifts in demand are increase in demand. Leftward shifts are decrease in demand. Let's see why. Let's go to this diagram. At a $100 price, on the old curve, I was demanding 100 units. If I trace it down. If I now trace that $100 price to the shifted out curve, you're demanding at the same price 300 units now. At the same $100 price, you just increased your demand by 200 units. So that's an increase in demand. And then I can make the same argument in the opposite direction for a decrease in demand. Okay, so what's causing these shifts leftward and rightward? Well, that's the next slide. Let's go through each of the factors because they're really important to understand. First is change in income. Now, this is an interesting one because about 90% of the time, when your income goes up, what do? You have bigger demand for most things. So, perfect example again, pandemic aside, when you have more income, you got a promotion, you got a raise. Now I'm going to Hawaii. Okay, before I wasn't going to Hawaii, now I am, and now I'm going to do the super deluxe package, okay, as opposed to just the regular package, because you have more income. So that makes sense. This is what we call a normal good. If you demand more of it when you have more income, it's a normal demand pattern or a normal good demand pattern. Now, the opposite of that is what happens if your income goes up and you actually demand less of the good. So that sounds like a crazy idea, but let me give you a great example. Fast food. When you become rich, you basically don't eat fast food as much, okay? Most people, middle income, they have, some days they eat fast food, other days they don't. But when you hit the lottery or you get that $1 million stock bonus kind of thing, what do? Okay, I'm cutting out fast food. I'm gonna eat at fancy restaurants my whole life, as long as I can. So fast food, you could say for most people winds up being an inferior good. Products that typically have lower, quality tend to be more on the inferior good side. Higher quality products tend to be normal goods, but that's a general directive. It's not a hard and fast rule. Okay, so changes in income normally are going to increase demand to the right. demand shifts to the right, increased demand. Unless it's an inferior good, in which case demand shifts to the left, which means we have a decrease in demand. Now, point number 2, prices of related goods and services. Okay, so this gets us into a discussion of substitutes and complements. So let me describe that briefly, because you need to understand that to understand the price effects. When you have a substitute, well, that's what we already talked about that, right? We talked about eating beef instead of chicken. Beef substitutes for chicken, and we buy more beef because the price of chicken went up. So that makes sense. If the price of chicken is going up, we're going to see a rightward shift in demand for beef or pork or anything but chicken that can substitute for chicken. That's a substitute. What about complements? Classic example here that everybody can usually relate to is peanut butter and jelly, right? Typically, you're having both together. They complement each other, okay? So here's what happens. If the price of peanut butter goes down, then what's going to happen to demand for jelly? Well, probably the demand for jelly is going to go up, okay? The curve is going to shift out to the right, because since peanut butter is now cheaper, I'm more likely to buy the peanut butter and the jelly and put them together on that sandwich, okay? Those are complements, 2 things that go together. Now, if the price of peanut butter goes up, what's going to happen to the demand for jelly? It's going to go down. The curve is now going to shift the other direction. It's going to shift to the left, because that's going to be, let me just go back to this little diagram. It's going to be this situation. Demand for jelly is going to shift to the left because peanut butter is getting too expensive. So therefore, I don't want as many peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. Okay? And by the way, I really hate peanut butter and jelly. I got to tell you that right now. I will never eat that stuff. But some people love it, and I'm not going to criticize them. Each his own. But the main idea is, again, the things go together. And so therefore, they're complements, and the price of one affects the demand for the other. Point number 3, consumer preferences and advertising. You know, again, I hate to use this example because it's giving everybody a major pain in the butt lately, but toilet paper, right? All of a sudden, we want toilet paper. We want to hoard it. The preference for toilet paper changed because of the virus. And so that demand curve did basically this to a large extent. It's like way out here now, but maybe out here, you'd even say, right? So preferences just change over time because of environmental shocks, like epidemics, like all of a sudden people just want to eat something like avocado toast. I don't know why avocado toast became such a big deal in the last 3 years, but it did. Everybody started eating it. And then, word got around and people saw other people eating it, and now everybody wants to eat avocado toast. So things like that just happen. Preferences can change overnight or over gradual time. And then advertising can change preferences, although advertising is not as strong an effect as it used to be because it's just too much of it. And that's a whole other topic of discussion. Okay. I think that when you understand, people just start liking things or stop liking things. If there's a health scare with something, right? We had, what was it, Alar on apples, go back 20 years or something like that. When people found out there was this chemical on apples called Alar that was causing cancer, nobody wanted to eat apples anymore. It was completely irrational response because you pretty much have to put some kind of thing on apples to keep them fresh. But people over exaggerated and they just dropped their demand for apples. So a big leftward shift there. Okay. Financial market conditions, what are we talking about here? So, now with the stock market doing terrible, and it's going to keep going down probably for weeks, if not months, people are just demanding less of most things, okay? Most normal goods, I should say, just because they don't think they're going to have the wherewithal to buy them. They want to save money. So financial market conditions very much drive, if you're invested in the market. If you're not invested in the market, then it probably doesn't matter that much. But if you are, it's going to affect your consumption and it's going to affect your demand. So market doing well, probably you're going to increase demand, shift out to the right. Market doing terrible, you're going to shift demand to the left. Expected future price, think about it. If you think the price of gas is going down tomorrow, are you going to wait till tomorrow to buy that gas? Of course you are, if you can. I mean, if you absolutely have to have it today, you're going to run out of gas, and of course you're going to buy it today. But if you're a good planner and you still have that quarter tank, you're going to wait till that gas price goes lower. Now, how do you know it's going to go lower? Well, maybe you do, maybe you don't. But the point is, in the case where you know it's going to go lower, or you have an inkling that it will, if you think price is going to head down, you're going to wait. And so demand drops now for the good. It will increase later, but it drops now. If you think price is going to go up in the future, what do? You increase your demand now. Okay. If you think a resource is going to be more scarce, you're going to demand it now. So you're going to see a rightward shift in demand. So it's all about your expectations of future prices driving demand today, either increase or decrease. The last one is, I think, the hardest to understand. Is just if the number of demanders is higher, then you have more demand. So you're going to see, to go back to my slide here, this situation where you're going to have a rightward shift, just because you have more people demanding something in general. Okay, so that one I think is fairly straightforward. Well, I think it is a good time to take a break. So I am going to stop us here, and I will see you all back in about 15 minutes. I have about a little less than 7:30 on my watch. Let's say 7:45. I will see you then. How's that sound? Okay, welcome back, everybody. So we were knee-deep in the discussion of demand curves and what causes demand to shift. And then we also distinguish between, I'll just review briefly, this situation where we have demand shifts to the left or right, the whole curve moves out or moves in, versus just going up and down that demand curve, which is solely to do with pricing changes. And then we went through the causes of why demand curves shift. And so if we look at the jeans example, if the curve goes from here, D0 to D1, that's a rightward shift. That's an increase in demand. What could have caused that increase in demand? Again, anything that we talked about on this slide that would increase demand, not decrease demand, because some of these can go in either, actually all of these can go in either direction depending on what's exactly happening. Okay, so this is, again, an increase in demand, not a movement up or down the demand curve. And it's vitally important that you understand the difference, because this is a big deal in economics when we talk about supply and demand. And again, the simple question you ask yourself is it a change related to the price of the good being demanded? If so, then it's this situation. If it's anything else, it's this situation. And that's how you distinguish between the two. Okay, now, we started talking about functions before, and we had a really simple function that said that the dependent variable was the quantity demanded and the independent variable was the price of the thing being demanded. Okay, and then we showed you a little equation with A's and B's. Now what we're going to do is just take a step back and go a little bit broader and say you can create a demand function for anything that makes sense. A lot of things drive demand, as in everything here, right? This slide that we spent some time on. So, and there's more. That's not even the full list, but that's the main stuff. So let's revisit the idea of formulating a demand function with a few more terms now. And it turns out that you can specify functions in two ways. One is this little notation you're seeing here, which is called functional notation. And it basically says, let's go left to right, the quantity demanded, in this case of jeans, okay, we're talking about jeans as a product, is a function of, that's equals F, and then whatever is in the parentheses here are the factors that it's a function of. So let's look at the factors. We have three of them separated by commas. The first is the quantity demanded of jeans is a function of its price, of course. That's the law of demand. And then there's the price of skirts. Now, skirts in the model we're defining here are essentially substitutes for jeans. They wouldn't be complements because you don't wear jeans and skirts at the same time. You wear one or the other, and it's a choice between the two. So and I know I don't think skirts are as popular as they used to be, but at one point, women were choosing between jeans and skirts. Okay, so there was a substitution effect. But the point is that the price of skirts actually has an effect on the quantity demanded of jeans, so that we want to enter into the model what the price of the skirts are, so it helps us get a kind of more finely honed model of the quantity of jeans demanded. Okay, so we have price of jeans, which we don't put a subscript there because it's assumed it's the price of the thing being demanded. But here we put the subscript skirts because now it's something else. It's not the jeans product anymore. It's the substitute. And then our last factor is income, what people make at their jobs. And that, of course, would drive the demand for jeans. Now, this particular model doesn't have every factor. I could throw in other things like the state of the economy and the markets and whether you think price of jeans are going to go up or down, or brand loyalty to a certain jean. There's millions of things you could put in there. But the point is, you never want to do that. What you're typically trying to do with these models as an economist or as a marketer, actually, is to focus on a few major factors, and that's it. Because you want to know the effects of those few major factors that you can control. Okay, and so you ask, how do I control income? Isn't that what people make? Well, no, you can market to certain incomes and not market to other incomes, right? That's segmentation, if you learn that in marketing. So, maybe you can't control the price of skirts, but as an economist, you're not necessarily worried about controlling anything. As a marketer, you might be worried about that. So, okay, the point is, this is a small list of things that actually literally affect the demand, but that's okay because that's what we care about. So that's the notation, and then you put it in equation form. The QD stays the same. Now you notice this we saw before. This is nothing new. This is your intercept and your slope for price. But now what's new is we're adding on another term here, which has to do with the price of skirts. And the price of skirts is the variable. Its slope coefficient is C, because we want to distinguish it from B, so we'll go in order of the alphabet. And then we've got yet another term here on the end, which is related to income and its slope, which is D. So let's just talk about income as a separate component. What we're saying here is the quantity demanded of jeans depends on people's incomes. Okay, when we talk about people, it's the market, whoever the market is that we're studying. So that you can define that a million different ways, but whoever the market is, and they have a certain average income level. And for every dollar increase in income, it's going to have a D effect, a little D effect on the quantity demanded of jeans. So just to throw out a number as an example, it could be that as your income goes up, let's say we calculate income at $1,000 increments. Every $1,000 income goes up, maybe you demand another pair of jeans. Okay, that's probably too extreme, but let's just keep it simple. And that's what that little D represents. The gold is in these letters, A, B, C. Actually, we don't care so much about A, but B we care about, C we care about, D. That's where the information is. And where do you get all this stuff? This comes from regression. You run regressions. We're going to talk, regressions is pretty much the last topic we discussed in the course, but essentially it's a way to come up with these numbers so you can fill out this whole equation. Okay, so now, you know two ways of representing these functions, both functionally and in an equation form, and we'll come back to that throughout the course. All right, now we move on to the flip side of things. We talked a lot about demand. Now it's time to talk about supply, which, by the way, drives me crazy because every title for this topic is supply and demand. So we should be discussing supply first and demand second, but we're doing the reverse because it makes more sense to do that. So they really should call the topic demand and supply, but they don't. But anyway, here we are, supply. And this is what producers are willing to produce. And of course, again, it depends on price. What is the price of the good? The higher the price of the good is, the more I'm willing to supply as a supplier. Okay, so coming back to our coffee example, if I sell coffee for $1 versus $4, when would I rather supply that coffee or sell that coffee? Obviously, when I can get $4 rather than $1. Okay, and again, I know you're thinking there's exceptions to that. There's low-cost producers and low-cost providers. Yes, you're right. However, in general, the general idea is the higher the price I can get, the more I supply. And that leads to the supply curve, which demonstrates or bears out that idea nicely in graphical format. The axes are still the same. You've got price on the vertical. You've got quantity now supplied on the horizontal axis. And notice the slope of the supply curve is positive or direct, opposite of the demand curve, which was from here to here. It was a negative slope because of the law of demand. The law of supply says the higher that price goes, go up the price axis, I'm going to supply more. So let's take a simple example here of point A and point B. At point A, I'm selling for $60 a pair of jeans, and I am supplying 300 million as a market, basically, okay? Now, if I can increase the price to $80 and I trace that out to the quantity supplied, it goes to 400 million. So I increase the amount supplied by 100 million pairs of jeans because I increased the price from 60 to 80. So what are we talking about here? We're talking again about supplier behavior across an entire market. If you look at all the suppliers of this jean product, the sum total of all will be an increase in quantity supplied from 300 to 400,000 if the price goes from 60 to 80. Okay. And again, I know what you're thinking. Supplier A is going to, maybe increase it a little bit, and B is going to increase it a lot. There's going to be differences between suppliers. It's what's the market average going to do, basically, when we're selling the exact same thing under the same conditions. So when you talk about economic concepts, you always have to think in the back of your mind, we're holding everything else constant, so that we can just talk generically about what's going to happen in the market. Okay. And so just beware of that and realize that that's the hand waving part of economics that sometimes people or economists get criticized for, is they don't think about these little nuances. But economists are not trying to necessarily talk about one firm. We're trying to talk about an entire market of firms and what's going to happen in the market. Okay, so that's the law of supply. And then we have the analogous situation with shifts in supply as opposed to going up and down the curve, which is just solely related to price. We can shift supply out to the right, which means we have an increase in supply. Let's look at what's happening. At a price of $60, I used to supply 300 million. Now I'm supplying 500 million. Or here, at a price of $80, just to take one example, I used to supply 400 million, but now the supply curve shifts out to here. Leftward shift is a decrease in supply. So now I'm only supplying 200 million. And so it's, again, the same thing as demand, but the slope of the curve is positive as opposed to negative. And then you ask the question, well, what is going to cause these shifts? Because, with this situation, it's just about the price going up or down. Price goes up, I supply more. Price goes down, I supply less. But for these situations, you come back to this laundry list of factors. Let's discuss them. So the first is input cost. I think it would make perfect sense to you that if something is expensive to produce or gets more expensive to produce, I'm going to produce less of it. Okay, all else equal. So what does that mean? You know what happens. We have commodities, we have resources that we use. It could be water, it could be steel, it could be anything that goes into making that car, whatever you're making. But if the cost of those ingredients, food, right? You're making meals for people. The cost of those ingredients go up, then supply shifts to the left. Supply is going to, as a market phenomenon, shift downward. If input costs go down, it's the opposite. Then you're going to see a rightward or an increase shift in supply. Okay. Prices of related goods. This one's a little more complicated than the demand side, but think of it this way: if I could produce something else that's going to fetch a higher price, then why wouldn't I produce it? Okay. Why would I keep producing the thing that I'm producing now? So it really depends on the price of related goods, what that's going to do to my particular supply of this particular product. So if I'm making red cars and the market all of a sudden will pay more for blue cars, I'm going to shift production towards blue cars. So supply of blue cars is going to go up and supply of red cars is going to go down. So you're going to see a rightward shift for blue and leftward shift for red. Okay, so just think about it in terms of prices of other products, not the one I'm making, but prices of other products and whether I follow that that trend or not. Technology typically, but not always, typically makes supply go to the right. In other words, increase in supply. Again, you'll find millions of counterexamples, so it's not a hard and fast rule. But what is technology supposed to do for us? Make our lives easier, allow us to make more product cheaper, quicker, with less hassle, smarter, right? Artificial intelligence. So the net effect of all of that, cheaper, I should say too, is to shift supply out to the right. Okay, but every now and then you find a good counterexample where technology makes things worse and decreases supply, especially when you have bugs in the technology, right? Okay, state of nature. Boy, is this one timely, right? So the things that we're demanding now are different than they were 4 weeks ago before the whole pandemic started, or at least got to the point where it is now. So things like pandemics or epidemics, climate changes, weather, anything that's volatile, stock market will change the state of nature and will increase or decrease supply of goods depending on what's needed and not needed. Okay. Expected future price works kind of the same way as on the demand side. Now you're a producer, so you're looking and saying, okay, if the price of this thing is going up in the future, I'm going to supply less of it now. I'm going to wait till the future happens and people will pay that higher price. So supply shifts left or down now, and it's going to shift right later. But the point is, right now, the supply of that good goes down, and it's a leftward shift. If the price is going to go down in the future, what happens? I supply more now because I want to get that higher price and higher revenue now. So that would be a rightward shift. Number of suppliers works like number of demanders or buyers. If we have higher number of suppliers, there's going to be more supply. We have a rightward or increased shift in supply. Okay, so once again, make sure you understand the difference between supply shifts where the whole curve moves like here versus just moving up and down the supply curve, which is simply a response to a change in price, nothing else. These guys have everything to do with this, any one of these, which again is a pretty good exhaustive list actually. You could pretty much classify most things in life according to one of these, 6 bullet points that would make supply shift. Okay, now we looked at functions on the demand side. Now it's time to look at functions on the supply side. So the simplest function we can do is the law of supply, where we say in equation form that the quantity supplied is equal to some intercept R plus a price term times its slope coefficient. Here we're calling the slope S. Okay, now what is this? This is, again, it's the law of supply, and it's basically the same thing that you saw with law of demand, except now we're looking at it from a supply perspective. Functionally, the way you represent it is much simpler. Just quantity supplied is a function of the price of the goods supplied. Easy. Okay. Let's talk about dependent and independent variables again here. We're saying that price drives supply, or supply is a function of price. So you always ask, what's affecting what? The thing that is getting affected here is the quantity supplied. So that's your dependent variable. The thing that's driving the quantity supplied is the thing that's independent, or your price in this case. Okay, so that's, again, the simplest model we can put together for looking at supply, and then we can make it more complicated, but we won't. We're going to leave it there because I want to talk about other things as opposed to complicating the supply models. Okay, so now that we have supply and demand defined and how we do the functions and the graphs, we look at putting them together, and this is where the rubber meets the road. Okay, meaning now we really get to the bottom of what's going to happen in a market, because markets have supply according to the supply curve, the red curve here, and they have demand according to the demand curve here. So when you put them together, you juxtapose them, you wind up with this intersection point, just like we did on the marginal cost and marginal benefit curves. And this is a really, really important point, because this is the point at which the market is going to sell the good and produce the good. So in this particular example, what happens? We intersect both curves here at 300 million quantity of jeans and a price of $60. How do I know? Just trace it down to the axes where this point is. So what does that mean? That means the market is literally going to supply 300 million pairs of jeans, and it's going to charge $60 for those jeans. And again, yeah, somebody's going to charge $61 and somebody's going to charge $58, but they're different jeans probably, and the differences are so minuscule that we don't even care because the average is 60 bucks. Okay, so think about it that way. What we're talking about here from a vocabulary standpoint is what are called equilibrium prices and quantities. The idea of an equilibrium in economics is where it all settles out, okay? Things happen, there's prices quoted, and consumers reject them and accept them, but where it all ends out at the end of the day is the equilibrium. And we're going to come back to the notion of equilibrium again and again in this course. But as far as production and price are concerned, we have an equilibrium price, which is 60 bucks. We have an equilibrium quantity, which is 300 million, and that is the price and quantity at which the market operates for this product. It is also known as the market clearing price and quantity, which means that theoretically all of this stuff should sell at this price, and you should have, you know, at the end of the day, when all this is bought, zero inventory, which, you know, never happens, but you get most of the time you get pretty close to that. And if you don't get close to zero inventory, there's a reason, and it's because you're not selling at the equilibrium price. Okay, you're either selling too high or too low, but hold that thought for just a second. We'll come back to that. All right, so really, really important, equilibrium price, equilibrium quantity. How do I get it? Just find out where the curves touch, intersect. Okay, that's that equilibrium point, and you've got it. Okay, so now we can actually put some numbers to this. So remember, we introduced demand functions and supply functions, and they're just literally equations and with numbers. Okay, so here the quantity demanded is equal to the intercept of 600 million minus 500 million times the price, and the quantity supplied is equal to 5 million times the price. These two 5 millions, by the way, are coincidentally equal. There's nothing, that almost never happens, but it just happened here. Okay, so the holy grail question is, given those demand and supply functions, and oh, by the way, where do we get these numbers from? The 600 million, the 5 million regression. These are regression models, but don't worry about that if you don't know what that is. We'll get back to that later in the course. So the holy grail question is, what is the equilibrium price and quantity? Okay, well, here's how you figure it out. You set the quantity demanded equal to the quantity supplied, and then you've got a quantity demanded term here, and then you got your quantity supplied term here. Just borrow it from the last slide, right? We've defined all that here. So once you do that, it's just a little bit of algebra. I'm not going to go through the algebra because you did that 20 years ago, and you probably, hopefully, still remember how to do it. But when you solve for the P, which is the only thing you can solve for at this point, first you have to solve for the price. Always solve for the price first. It comes out to $60. Okay, so we now know the equilibrium price is 60 bucks, and what we do then is plug that $60 back into either equation, either the demand equation or the supply equation. The supply equation is almost always going to be easier. It's shorter. Look at the difference, right? So I just put it back into the supply equation. The price is 60 bucks that we found before, and multiply it by 5 million, you've got 300 million. So that's the quantity supplied. Now we have a price of 60. We have a quantity supplied of 300 million, and we've done the job of figuring out the equilibrium characteristics. Okay, so simple, just a little bit of algebra and substitution, and you got it. You'll see a few of those problems in the homework. And so now we will move in. So, you know, again, it's not that you're just making these models to have nice information. Number one, you use them for prediction. Number two, you use them for things like figuring out equilibrium quantities. And economists do this all day long, and some marketers too. There are direct applications for this stuff. Okay, the next topic we get into is surplus. This is, you know, kind of like I said before to Donna's question when she said, you know, how do we do this and how would we use it? Surplus is one of those things that you can talk about philosophically and then also talk about in terms of calculating it, but it tends to be more of a societal concept and not so much a business concept. But you still can't leave an economics course not knowing about surplus, because economists talk about it all the time in just about any economic endeavor. So this section's a little bit more kind of government / society focused and less kind of marketer focused, and that's okay. We'll just spend a little time here on surplus. Okay, so what am I talking about? So remember we talked about surplus on the marginal cost and marginal benefit curves right at the beginning of the course when we looked at marginal benefit and marginal cost. And we said you do anything in life to the point where MC equals MB. Well, the same idea is going to apply here, but now we're talking about markets of people, buyers and sellers, and we're going to define surplus in that context. Okay, so let's just start out with a simple example here. The marginal benefit of a pair of jeans is $100, and the marginal cost of that pair of jeans is $20. So what is the surplus in that situation? Well, just subtract the two numbers. 100 minus 80, 100 minus 20 is $80. Okay, marginal benefit minus marginal cost, which is at a kind of a point on those curves, and we're going to kind of get away from the idea of doing point estimates. But for that particular point of activity, we have a $80 surplus, and now we're saying it's a surplus to society. Because we have, again, multiple buyers and multiple sellers, and so we're acting as a group of people, not just one person, like we defined it before. So why this matters is that what you want to do from a governmental perspective or a societal perspective, and of course businesses are involved in that. It's the government doesn't produce anything. The government, it just kind of tries to facilitate production in a way. But across the entire spectrum of people and markets, you want society to be as well off as you can make it. And the thing that does that is to produce at the efficient quantity, okay? And the efficient quantity winds up being the quantity that maximizes the surplus for society. That means consumers and producers, basically. Okay, so what's the maximal or maximum surplus? It's basically almost always going to be the equilibrium quantity. So what do I mean by equilibrium quantity? Let's go back a couple of slides here. And it's this, right? In this particular diagram, the demand supply intersected at 300 million quantity of jeans. So if we're producing at that quantity, we are maximizing surplus for society. Okay, so that's what we want to do. We want to encourage markets to produce at that maximum surplus quantity. And let's look at it diagrammatically. Okay, so same supply and demand curve we saw before with the jeans. We figured out that the quantity that we produce at is 300 million because that's where the curves intersect. And so if you trace from that point back to the vertical axis and form this green triangle, this green triangle is a graphical representation of how much surplus is being created by selling at a quantity of 300 million for a price of $60, okay? And what you can then do is break that total green surplus into two pieces, the first of which is consumer surplus. And let me try to explain it to you in simple terms using the graph. So here's what happens, okay? If I go to the top of the curve, like right around here, this is about, I don't know, $119 or something of a price. If I trace it out to the y-axis, people, consumers, would have actually paid $119 for these jeans. It wouldn't have been many, because if you trace it down to, you know, the quantities demanded, it would have been, I don't know, like 20 or 30. But the point is, some quantity would have been demanded at this high price. If I go down to $100, how much are going to be demanded? 100 jeans. So now you're having even more demand. But the point is, people would have paid $100. Let me do one more example. If I brought the price down to $80, then you would have sold 200 million jeans. People would have paid $80. But what did they pay? In all these cases, they paid $60 because that's what the equilibrium was. So the consumers saved versus what they would have paid at higher prices by paying a price at the equilibrium level. So if I trace out that $60 to the equilibrium point and I look at all these other prices they would have paid and I form this little area of triangle, that's half of the surplus that belongs to the consumer. It's a surplus because the consumer would have paid a higher price, but they're paying a lower price. So you're getting a bargain, essentially. So who doesn't like a bargain? Who doesn't feel good getting a bargain? Who isn't better off getting a bargain? That's the idea of surplus. The idea of some people want to think of surplus as profit, but consumers don't really profit, right? Do they? They get benefits. So the higher the surplus they get, the more benefit they get. And what economists try to talk about a lot of the time is who's getting the surplus. Is it the consumers or is it the producers? Is it the government? It can be a lot of different parties to the transaction. But in this particular example, diagrammatically, the consumer surplus is the area of this triangle. So you remember your old high school algebra, base times height divided by 2. So it's 300 times the difference between 60 and 120 is 60. 300 times 60 divided by 2, whatever that number is. Economists can literally calculate the dollar value of that consumer surplus. Okay, but it's happening again because consumers are paying less than they have to based on the equilibrium price, because only one price gets charged. It's the $60 in this case. Now, the flip side of this is, what about the producer? The producer, think about the producer from the producer standpoint. If the price is this low, like almost $0, let's say it's $2, there's going to be some minuscule amount of supply. It's going to be, I don't know, 20 jeans. As I raise the price to $20, then I'm going to supply more as a market of suppliers. I raise the price even more to $40. Now I'm supplying even more, 200. But the point is, the price I'm actually getting in all these cases is $60. That's the price consumers are paying, right? Same price. So while I would have been willing to sell it for less, I can actually get more for it now at this price level. So if I trace out all that difference, it's this lower triangle, and that's what we call producer surplus. Okay, so producer surplus on the bottom, consumer surplus on the top, the whole shebang called total surplus. Okay, and again, a lot of what economists look at is what's the division between this and this. Because generally speaking, if you're a classical economist, you want to maximize this, and you don't care so much about this. If you're a supply side economist, a Republican, then you probably want to maximize this, and you don't care much about that. Okay, but don't tell anybody I said that. But it's obvious anyway. Okay, so this surplus, the way you break it up, is a really important concept in governmental economics. Okay, now a related concept to this is deadweight loss. You're going to see it follows directly from everything we've just been talking about. It's a very simple concept. Where should markets be producing? At the equilibrium quantity. How do we know the equilibrium quantity? It's the intersection of supply and demand at that one point. Okay. So to the extent that you are not producing at that equilibrium quantity, even by 1 unit, you're either producing more or less than that equilibrium quantity, you have what's called a deadweight loss. Okay, so let's look at, again, economists love graphs. Let's look at it graphically. Where should we be producing these genes? Right here at 300. That's the equilibrium where the curves intersect. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that the market is producing 200 million pairs of jeans. That's too little. We should be producing 300, not 200. So if I trace out the area of this triangle from the equilibrium point to the point of production, the area of this curve, the area of this triangle is how much you are losing in surplus because of that underproduction. And again, you could divide this into 2 pieces. The top piece would be the consumer's loss. The bottom piece would be the producer's loss. But the point is, the whole thing is what we call a deadweight loss. Because, think about it, you produce more jeans, more people can buy those jeans, and they can have more surplus. Because again, until you get to that intersection point, you are having incrementally less and less surplus for everybody, but it's still more surplus. So if you produce below that line, then you are taking away from surplus. Again, the surplus used to be, let me go back to the green. The surplus used to be this. Now basically you're cutting out this little chunk here because you're underproducing. We're taking out that piece. So you're left with this trapezoid here. That's the remaining surplus. But this piece here is called the deadweight loss from underproduction. Now, the flip side of it is you produce too much. What's the problem with overproduction? Companies make stuff and it sits there on the shelves. Okay, so now the company lost money and the consumers basically are losing surplus because they don't need this stuff. So in our example, 300 was the equilibrium. Now we produce at 400. And so this triangle comes out as a deadweight loss to what we originally had as this is the maximum total surplus you can ever have. Okay, and again, you only do that or you only get that when you produce at the equilibrium quantity and price. So you could have deadweight losses on either side of the equilibrium point. This is from overproduction, this is from underproduction, but the point is that you're going to lose in either case, and economists want to quantify that. And again, you can quantify this. Just take your base height times divided by 2. So this would, let's do this one. They're the same. 40 to 80 is 40 times the height, which is 100. So multiply those two numbers and divide by 2. Whatever that number is your deadweight loss from overproduction and from underproduction if you're producing here at 200. Okay, but why do we care? We care because what's the goal in economics? Maximize surplus for society. Who's society? Producers and consumers. Again, how you distribute the surplus among the two depends on your philosophical and political orientation, but let's not worry about those nuances. We want to maximize that surplus one way or another. And so you want to hit that equilibrium production quantity to the extent that you can. Always easier said than done, of course, okay? But again, sometimes we're talking about this more philosophically than mathematically, and that's fine. Okay. That's surplus. The last topic here is shifts in equilibrium. So, you know, before we just looked at one situation where supply and demand are juxtaposed and we came up with an equilibrium quantity. What happens when those curves start shifting? What does it do to two major things, right? Price and quantity. What price are people going to pay? And what quantity are they going to buy? And what quantity are firms going to produce at? We have to know those. We want to know those numbers. We need to know them in a lot of cases. So that's what we call shifts in equilibrium. And the answer is, I don't know until I analyze. You have to do the analysis to see what's going to happen to P and Q. So let's look at a couple of examples. And this is where I start pulling out the whiteboard here. And we'll start simple. 1 and 2 are very simple, and then 3 is the most complex one of the 3. So here we go. 1 says, what happens to equilibrium price and quantity if we see an increase in the number of buyers? And again, we always have to say in economics, we're going to hold everything else constant. Otherwise, the analysis gets too complicated and we can't do it. So if you remember back a few slides ago, we said, what are the things that can shift demand curves? One of them was the sheer number of buyers or demanders. If that goes up, increases, then that's going to shift the demand curve out to the right. We have an increase in demand. So now I'm going to pull up my whiteboard, and this may take me a few seconds here. So it's going to be a new share. I'm going to pull up the whiteboard and share that with you. So I'm going to draw some lines here representing our axes. And this will, of course, be very rough. Okay, and we start out with an original demand curve and an original supply curve. And what's happening here? So we have, well, let's first trace down the equilibrium quantity. So I can do that here. This would be my equilibrium quantity, Q, and this would be my equilibrium price, P, for the first set of demand curves. And let me see if I can draw that in. No, that's too much. Let's get rid of that and just go back to I'm going to just draw, let's see here, draw a line here, clear, I do. Should be able to just draw a P here. Nope, not letting me. Okay. And this doesn't want to delete either. All right, we're going to clear this all. Start over. Draw a line. Whoops. Clear all drawings. Line here, straight. Demand curve, supply curve. And then we've got equilibrium quantity, whoops. Equilibrium price, whatever that is. Okay, and then I think if I go to draw and I do this, that should let me do the P star, or I'll call it P0. I know this is really rough, and this will be Q0. 0 always refers to the initial condition. Okay. Now what happens is what? We have an increase in the number of buyers, and this was our original demand curve, D0. This was our original supply curve, S0. So I'm going to move the demand curve out to the right. I'll just do a rough one here and call this D1. Okay. So what happened now to our quantity and our price? Basically, both of them went up. This is our new price, P1. This is our new quantity, Q1. And it's higher. The price is higher. It went from P0 to P1. The quantity went from Q0 to Q1. So I'll put an arrow there, and I'll put an arrow here. And so that's the answer to our question. The price goes up by some level, and the quantity goes up by some level in our new equilibrium. Okay, that's what happens when you have a shift. Now, all I did was shift the demand curve. So that's a very simple thing. You're going to see in the last example, we're going to move both curves. But in the simple example here, you can tell that quantity demanded goes up, and you can tell that price goes up. By how much? That depends on the extent of the shift of the curve. So, you know, if I did another shift all the way out here and called that D2, then you would have seen price go up big time and quantity go up big time. That would have been an arrow like this and an arrow like this. So you have to know the extent of the shift of the demand, and that's just something that you're going to model with regression. Okay, so don't worry about the numbers, just worry about the general concept. So let's clear this, and let's look at problem number 2. I'm going to shift back to my screen. And it says, what happens to equilibrium price and quantity if there's an increase in resource costs for resources used in the production of goods, holding everything else constant? So if you remember the things that can shift supply, one of them was input or resource cost. And what we said was there's an inverse relationship. The higher those resource costs go, the less supply you're going to have. You're going to see a leftward shift in supply. So let's look at the diagram again. I'm going to do a new share with my whiteboard. And I'm going to draw some lines again. 1, 2, not going to worry about getting it perfect. We have a supply curve. I'm sorry, demand curve. That's your demand curve. We have a supply curve. And that's our initial condition. So let's label it that way just to be complete. So this is demand initial. This is supply initial. And then what do we say? The supply is going to shift to the left. So I'm going to put in a supply curve that does this. What was our initial equilibrium? It was right here and right here. Right? This was our initial quantity. This was our initial price. Right at this intersection point. But now we have a new intersection point up here. So price was here and quantity is here. So I'm going to call that Q1 and I'm going to call that P1. So let's take a look at what happened. Quantity actually went to the left. The market is going to produce a lower quantity. And this is why we don't like, as economists, we don't like that. We almost always want quantity to go up because it means getting more goods to more people. But then, of course, the overproduction problem we talked about a slide ago. But don't worry about that. Okay, but the main point is quantity goes down, supplied, and then the price is going to go up. Okay, so is that good? Probably not. In most cases, probably not a good result. But that's what happens when your raw materials go up in price. is you have a lower quantity produced and you have a higher price paid and received by the producer. The consumer pays, the producer receives. Okay, so that's situation number 2. Let's go back to the last one, which is the most complex, but I promise you not too bad in any case. What happened to my, oh wait.
Jordan,
Yes.
can we say that's a perfect example of the housing market then? Especially during like pre-recession?
The housing market, well, yes, okay, I'm not going
Just
to
in terms of resources and demand.
Yeah, no, okay, so yes and no. My answer to your question is yes and no. Let me explain why. In terms of input costs, yes, it's more expensive to make a house nowadays than it used to be. So you know, things like any commodity you use, wood, steel, whatever, it's all gone up in price. So you saw that happening with the cement supply to the left. The other big one was, in California, obviously, land has gotten ridiculously expensive. So that was also an input cost. Mm-hmm. So yes, the bigger driver, however, of the housing market was just demand, because there's too many jobs here. The economy's been too good, and everybody wants to live in California. Okay, and then I tell all my East Coast friends, "Hey, fires! Look at the fires. Maybe you'll change your mind this year." But that's a new thing, sort of. So the economic story going on with housing is, yes, you have supply decreases, but you also have, on the other side, much bigger increases in demand, and that drove more of the
price.
The price increase, yeah. So great question. Okay. Actually, I'm going to stop share here and then go back to a new share with that. Okay, screen 1, and then, okay, so here we are, back to the problem number 3. Okay, so this is the most complex one, and this one may drive you a little bit crazy, but don't worry about it. Just kind of hear me out on this one. So let's look at the situation. What happens to the price and quantity if we have both a decrease in resource cost? Now, notice it's a decrease, not an increase. Okay, look at this word here, decrease in resource costs. So it's the opposite of what we just looked at. And an increase in the number of buyers. So that one we did before. Okay, we said demand, increase in number of buyers. What happens? Demand shifts rightward. Increase in demand. Decrease in resource costs. What's going to happen to supply? It's going to shift rightward as well. So let's diagram it. You have to do the diagrams for these to get the answer right. So back to the whiteboard. Let's clear this ugliness here. And let's start over. So I'm going to draw my supply and demand functions after I do my graph here. Initial conditions, supply, demand, let's label it. This is going to be supply initial. This is going to be demand initial. And we have initial, that's a terrible line, but okay. Quantity, initial equilibrium, and then supply, price initial from equilibrium. There we go. Okay, so that's the initial situation. Now let's figure out demand first. We said increase in the number of buyers. So that means demand shifts out rightward, increase in demand. And we're going to call that D1. But I can't stop there. I also have to shift the supply curve out to the right because we said that we're going to have an increase in supply because resource costs went down. So here we go. Supply is looking like this now. And we're going to call that supply 1. Okay, so what's the new equilibrium point? Be careful. Make sure you're tracing from the right curve. Where supply 1 intersects demand 1 is right here. I'm going to trace down to quantity 1. And then I'm going to trace, but actually I'm not going to really trace the price. I'm going to tell you why in a second, okay? Because the answer is we don't know what happened to price. I just drew this, but does this price look higher? Okay, let me actually do the tracing. I'm just putting in a line here to put in a line, but that line might not be right. Okay, let me undo that line because these prices might actually be the same. Actually, the price might even be lower than the initial price. I don't know. The reason I don't know is because I have to know how much this curve shifted out and how much this curve shifted out to determine what happens to pricing. The pricing answer is indeterminate in this case, and it depends again on the relative shifts of supply and demand curves. But what I do know for sure, this is indisputable, if I compare the quantities, the quantity went up for sure. Okay, and again, what the exact number is, I don't care at this point because we're just looking at this instructively in the generic sense. But in real life, the economist would actually get the numbers. That's fine. Okay, so definitely quantity increases. Price, I don't know, because let's look at this. Let's say this supply one curve was this. Let's put it all the way out here. That's it. Oh, actually, let's undo that and do a better one. Let's go back to the lines here. Okay, so I'm going to say supply one is now down here. And we'll call this supply one. Okay, so we know what happens to quantity, but now let's see what happens to price. Supply one intersects demand one here, and definitively I can say price dropped. Okay, arrow down, because it was such a big increase in supply. But let's undo all this. And say that it was a tiny little increase in supply. So let's just do a curve right here. Supply starts out here at SO, and then it goes this way, like a little tiny increase. So this is my supply one, S1, and where's the new equilibrium? It's right here. Okay, demand one equals supply one. Now I trace the price out. Terrible trace, sorry. Now I can definitively say price went up. Okay, and that's the magnitude of the shift. So again, depending on, and I could make the same story up with the demand curves. I can do this back and forth business all day long. And the moral of the story is, I don't know. I don't know what's happening to price until I know the extent of the demand and supply shift relative to each other. So that's going to happen in some cases. Look out for that on the homeworks. 90% of the time, you'll know which way the Q's go and which way the P's go. 10% of the time, it's going to be indeterminate. And again, the answer is depends on the extent of supply and demand shift, which hopefully you know in real life. Okay. Now, the other thing to mention on this is we're looking at, two simple things at a time in this case. In the other cases, it was one thing at a time, one shift. In real life, what happens? A million things shift. Okay, but what you try to do as an economist, as a modeler, is just pick the top 2 or 3 things that you care about and model changes in prices and quantities based on that. Okay, so we might have another thing in this diagram that has to do with technology, making supply even better. So here's our new supply curve. We'll call it S2. And it shifted from S1 to S2 because the S1 represented a shift for the other thing, which was resource cost. Now the S2 shift is a technology shift. So again, I'm getting into probably more than we need to talk about, but just understand that there are complexities involved. Okay, so back to the, yes.
Sorry to bother you. Would a simple example be like the price of gas? Like right now it's going down. So, OPEC's probably flooded the market with lots of petrol. So what we're seeing is a reflection in the market, decreased price of gas. I don't know, just as a simple example, would that be right?
Right, so what's happening now with gas is that they're flooding the market because they figure nobody's going to buy it. And so they're just, what OPEC does is they just cut production all the time. They cut it or they raise it, and that has an effect on supply. So you're seeing basically it's a rightward shift in supply, to put it in terms that we've been talking about, and it's driving the price down. They're just supplying more at every given price. Okay. Because they figure by driving the price down, they'll get people to buy more gas, which is really not going to happen. So it's, economists and companies do things all the time. It doesn't mean they work. And that's going to be a great example because you can't go anywhere, at least in California, right? We're all stuck in our homes, basically. And who the heck wants to go anywhere other than the millennials, right? That's exactly what's happening. It's a rightward supply, and they're just supplying more at any given price because they're basically trying to intersect demand at a higher quantity, and it's probably not going to work. Sorry to say.
But that has global impacts because if you look at Mexico, which is a major oil producing country, that means there's going to be less revenue unless they sell higher amounts or higher quantities of gasoline. So, I mean, I just think of this long-term global economic issue happening if the price of gas remains low. I don't know, just the way I think.
Okay, so what you're saying is, so I'm trying to parse your comment here. You're saying because the supply is going to be perpetually higher, at least for the short term, that what's going to happen?
Well, I'm looking at global markets like Mexico. Mexico is a producer of petrol. That's like one of their main gross domestic products, right?
Yeah.
And so when you drop the price of gas, the total gross domestic product of the country goes down. I mean, you just don't have that revenue like before. So it's there's just this impact when your price goes down, although what you're selling goes up.
Yes, you are correct, and everything I think you said, except the last thing you said. What is the last thing you said was something goes up, price goes up? No.
No. When you because they're selling higher volumes of petrol,
Yes.
but they're not getting the profit that they would have in the past before the shift in the so this shift you're demonstrating, and when you go from S1 to S2, it's you have to sell more to make what you were making prior.
Yes. In the case of gas, in this particular example, you do. It's not always the case that you have to sell more. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about next week, which is called elasticity. Yes.
Okay.
Perfect.
Sorry.
Great question. Yeah, no, basically what you said is right, which is that just, I guess, Mexico, but you could talk about other countries, Venezuela, the Middle East, right? So we're demanding less gas. So their GDP is probably going to go down, their gross domestic product, because we're just not buying it. And we're one of the biggest buyers of gas. So eventually they're going to produce less because they're going to see this is not going to work, at least in the short term, until we lick this virus thing. Okay, great. Great application. So here are the answers, and it's everything we just went through, so I won't talk about that. Let's get into our last topic here in supply and demand, which is price controls. Basically, a fundamental level of price control is when a government either tells you what the price is going to be for something, or it sets a range in which prices can be set. And so the most specific examples of that are either going to be what are called price ceilings or price floors. And if you think about your ceiling and your floor, well, you can't go below a floor, you can't go above a ceiling. So that's the kind of the logic and the nomenclature there. The problem with price ceilings, price floors, price controls in general is that they ignore or they circumvent or they attempt to circumvent equilibrium prices. Okay, again, think about equilibrium prices. That's where the market wants to go. The market wants to head towards an equilibrium price and an equilibrium quantity. Doesn't mean it always does, but there's an economic pressure to get there, and that's where it settles out. When you sell at any other price besides the equilibrium price, the market, that's unsettling to the market. The market's going to want to try to react to that by pushing the price back to equilibrium. Okay, so let's look at it. Again, economists love their diagrams, so we're going to look at some diagrams here. Let's talk about price ceilings first. Now, the other thing I want to say about price ceilings is, this will drive you a little bit crazy. Diagrammatically, the ceiling is below the equilibrium, not above it. When you think of ceilings, you think it should be at the top of the diagram, but it's actually the opposite of what you think, okay? Because a ceiling, again, says price can go no higher than this. And by definition, a price ceiling is below equilibrium price. What is equilibrium price here? Where does supply equal demand? At 800. Where are we setting price? We're setting it flat line here at 600. Okay, so if you trace the price of 600 to the two curves, what do you see? Quantity supplied, this is the supply curve, is going to be 900. Quantity demanded is 1500. So what's happening? Much more is being demanded than the market can supply at this, or wants to supply at this price. So what you have is exactly what you're seeing now with the toilet paper and any other thing in the grocery store that people want, is you're seeing shortages. Okay, and it's not because of price ceilings, it's just because of too much demand. But think about other applications where the price is lowered so much that everybody wants to get it now, okay? Because the law of demand says I'm going to demand more, and the price is low. So the difference between these two numbers is the amount of shortage. And shortages are what you get when you have price ceilings. Why? Because the price should be up here. It should be 800, but it's being set artificially at 600, lower than equilibrium. So what are some good examples? Rent control. Good luck getting a rent control apartment in San Francisco. If you can do that, I want to be your friend because you just did a miracle, okay, kind of a thing. Nobody gets rent control apartments because everybody wants them. Because while everybody else is paying $4,000 a month, you're getting it for $2,000 or something way below the equilibrium price. And why do governments do it? Because they want to provide housing. It's a noble goal. It's hard to argue with unless you're, conservative politically. But the problem is, you do it and nobody can get it because there's so few of them. And number two, too many people want the few of them that are out there. Okay, so politically, people run on this. They say, I created, affordable housing, and you're seeing laws being passed all over California now, but especially in the Bay Area about rent control and how landlords can't increase their prices. But what's happening is nobody's getting these houses or apartments because of the shortage. Okay, example number two, coming back to Serena's gas question, OPEC. Who determines supply of gas? Basically OPEC, because all the Middle Eastern countries who get together and say, this is how much we're going to produce based on, however much money they feel like making. Now they're in they're a little more vulnerable position because of the pandemic, but normally they're not, and they can dictate prices to a certain extent. So what happened in the 70s was that they were increasing prices, and the US government responded by saying, okay, OPEC, you can't sell gas at a price higher than X, whatever that X was, okay? So that was a price ceiling. And what happened in the 70s, if you were around then, I think most of you weren't, but if you were, you would have seen lines at gas stations that are looking like the lines we see in grocery stores now. People would line up for gas 3-4 hours a day, and then you would get to the pump and they'd be out of gas. Because again, what happens in price ceilings is there are shortages because, what happened was the equilibrium price went up really, really high. So in today's equivalent, maybe you were paying, or you should have been paying $5, $6, $7 per gallon of gas. But the government was making OPEC sell it at effectively $2-3 because, again, who wants to pay high gas prices, right? So the government wants to maximize consumer surplus. So we put in this price ceiling, and then it leads to shortages all over the place. Okay, so these are noble ideas in theory. In reality, where the rubber hits the road, what winds up happening is people just don't get product, and that's not good from an economic standpoint, obviously. Now, flip side of this, price floors. You can't go lower than a floor, but diagrammatically, it shows up above equilibrium. The market wants to sell at this price, in this case, $5.20, but the price is set higher artificially by government at about, $535, whatever that number is. So if you trace it across the curves, what happens? You have, at that price, much more supply than you have demand. So here we're supplying whatever this number is, about 2.2, and then we are only demanding about 1.0. So you have a surplus, and this is not the same surplus as consumer and producer surplus. This is excess inventory, okay? When you set price, so right, the price goes up of anything, what happens? You demand less of it, law of demand, sits on the shelves, you have a surplus. Not a good surplus, though. Okay, so that's the problem with price floors. And so the best example of price floors is minimum wage. Now, politically, you may agree with minimum wage. Okay, politicians run on it. We have it now in California. I think it's $15, might even go up. More and more states are looking at minimum wage, the more liberal states. And the problem with minimum wage is it's almost always going to be above the equilibrium wage for that market. So what does that mean? Well, everybody who wants to work is going to scream to work because they're making so much money. I mean, not so much. Obviously, minimum wage is still not enough in most cases. But the point is they were doing better than they were doing before when the market could dictate what that wage was. That equilibrium wage was lower. So the jobs get snatched up. And just like you can't find an apartment, now you can't find a job because everybody who wants to work that job is working it because they're doing better than they were before. So minimum wage is a perfect example of price floors. Agriculture, one of the stupidest things I ever saw government do, if you go back to the Great Depression, and I'm hoping we don't have another one of those, but you never know. But when, go back to the 30s, what did the government do? It basically paid farmers to destroy products, okay? They were trying to drive the price of farm products up, so they did all sorts of stupid things, and, why do you want to waste product? But you're trying to drive the price up, and that's basically an example of a price floor kind of an activity. They're doing things indirectly to drive price up. But you see this a lot in agriculture because, farmers, they can't make money. Being in agriculture nowadays, even these big factory farms, a lot of them just can't survive because the prices are too low for what they're selling because there's overproduction, okay, of stuff. And there's not enough, whatever product you want to talk about, whether it's tomatoes or wheat, we can produce way much more than consumers can actually demand. It's actually, in some ways, a good problem to have. But it drives prices down. So what do states like Maine do? They say the price has to be yay high for your product, and that's how they get, farms to be more profitable, so they can stay producing and stay in business. Okay, but again, it's artificial, and then you have excesses because the price is above equilibrium. So that's it on supply and demand. I am now going to move us on to, let's see, what time is it? 8:51. I'm going to try to talk for about another 20, 25 minutes because I want to get some stats in, and then we'll just ask if you have any questions and call it a night. So I'm going to switch completely over to statistics now. So put on your statistics hat, as they say. And so, that's what we'll do every week. We'll cover one or two economics topics, and then we switch over to statistics and try to cover one or two of those. But tonight, I think it's going to be probably two, but we'll see. Okay, so first things first, an introduction to what statistics is all about to get you grounded. And so these words here, describing, organizing, and interpreting information are key. Those are the three things you basically do with any statistics, calculations, or modeling that you're going to do. And then it turns out that statistics breaks into two major categories, descriptive and inferential. So let's talk about each of those in turn. Descriptive is exactly what it sounds like. You're describing something with data, and I'm going to talk about data or data sets. They're the same thing. It's basically, numbers and sometimes not numbers, but the stuff that we're going to analyze. And in this case, we're describing things like, we could do a description of what's the average age of everybody in this class. If I had to guess, probably about 28. Everyone's favorite ice cream flavor, mine is cookie dough. You can tell me yours later. Average income of the population, the median
Hey,
income.
Jordan,
Yes.
I think we're still looking at the supply and demand PowerPoint.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Let me go back to, let me stop share and then do a new share. I wonder why that happened. Okay. There we go. Sorry about that. Okay. So, you're seeing it now, right?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Sorry about that. I don't know why that happened, but I will figure it out. Okay, so what I said was statistics is about describing, organizing, and interpreting data. There's two major branches, descriptive and inferential. Descriptive is describing data, and then things like how old are we, what's our favorite ice cream, how much income do we have on average, and then what's our highest education level. Why is this descriptive? Because you're basically just saying the character, you're talking about or modeling the characteristics people have or populations have, as opposed to the other branch of statistics, which is inferential, which means now you're making estimates of a bigger group of people from a smaller group of people. So this is exactly what gets done in political polling. I know coronavirus is first and foremost on our minds. But before all that happened, we were knee-deep entrenched in the election on the Democratic side, looking at all these primaries. And every time we have a primary or about to have a primary, what do? We take a poll of what people are thinking. Who are they going to vote for? Because we want to basically see, we want to predict the winner, and then we want to kind of, the politicians want to know themselves, but they need to do better. So what they do is they ask a small group of people some questions, and they take the information from the small group of people and apply it to the larger groups of people, like the state of California, like the entire United States. Okay, so my example is we're going to poll 30,000 Americans about who they support for president. Now, obviously, there are not 30,000 people in this country. We have 300 million plus people living in this country. Some of them can't vote, but let's just say it's 300 million that can vote. You're going to talk to all 300 million people and ask them who you're voting for and why? No, of course not. You don't have the time. You don't have the money. So what you do is you take a sample, which is, in this case, $30,000, and you project the results from the sample to the population. And that's what we call inferential statistics, using a small level of data to make inferences about a larger group of people or things called a population. So let's talk about some more inferential examples. Let's talk about advertising measurement. Any ad, by the way, that comes out on TV or on radio or even on the web now, those things, if it's a big enough company, it's going to be tested. You don't just put out an ad and see how it goes. You basically show it to people and see what their reactions are. So let's say we have 100 consumers, keep it simple. We divide them into two groups of 50 each randomly. And then we're trying to see if the ad does better with a celebrity in it or without a celebrity in it. Because sometimes, we don't like the celebrity or we don't like the personality. Other times we like the celebrity. So we're not sure in this case if it's going to work. So one group of 50 gets to see the ad with the celebrity. The other group sees the ad without the celebrity, just an ordinary person. And we're going to see which ad does better. And there's all sorts of metrics we can look at for that, but it's not important what they are. Okay, so based on that small sample of 100 consumers, well, we're projecting that information across an entire population. Okay, let's say it's a TV commercial during the Super Bowl. Everybody watches the Super Bowl, not everybody, but most of the country watches the Super Bowl. So we're using results from 100 people to project across something like 200 to 300 million people. And that's what we mean by inference, is you take a small amount of data and project it across a larger group of people. And you're looking for, my bottom bullet point here, statistically significant differences. You're going to hear this term a million times. There's actually one major thing the statistics does that when you think about it and you boil it down, what is the bare essential of statistics in terms of what it does for you? It literally tells you whether two numbers are the same or different. And you go, wow, why do I need that? What the heck, what's the point? I mean, 4 and 5, those two numbers are different, right? What do I need statistics to tell me whether 4 and 5 are different? Well, actually, you need statistics to tell you that, because the 4 may not actually really be a 4, and the 5 may not actually really be a 5. So statistics has the last word on whether numbers are actually different or the same, even though they may appear to numerically be different or the same. Okay, it's kind of like, you go to court and you have a case and the two lawyers argue on both sides, but then the judge makes the decision. Well, statistics is the judge. Okay, the data are the lawyers, and the judge says, no, you're guilty, you're not guilty, you're liable, you're not liable. These numbers are the same, they're different. That's what statistics does for you. And that's what it's a big topic that we'll get into called statistical significance. Okay, so that's the intro, and now I get into the first topic, which is measures of central tendency. So just to do a check, are we seeing this? Yes? Okay. So the first topic you want to start with is, how do I describe a group of numbers?
No, I'm still seeing just the original one.
Oh, you are? Okay. Same thing with everybody? Let me pull this. Let me do a stop share and then I'll pull up a share. Okay.
Okay, thanks.
And I will figure out why that's happening, but I don't know. All right. So this is now measures of central tendency. We're all seeing that, yes? Okay, great.
It's showing up now.
Cool. Okay. So what I was saying was, you know, you have a bunch of people or a bunch of things, and they have some kind of characteristic like height, weight, age, income, whatever. And how do you come up with a way to describe the entire group with just one number, as opposed to looking at the numbers for each of the members of that group? And that idea is the idea of central tendency. And the default thought people have about central tendency, oh, it's an average of some sort. Well, it turns out average is a very vague term, and there are three averages that we're going to look at called mean, median, and mode. And there are different circumstances in which you use each of the three kinds of central tendencies, and we'll get into that in a few slides. So we're going to start with the most popular, and you've probably seen this before at some point. Almost everybody knows what a mean is, but if you don't, it is the central value in a data set, and it's the one that if you have a choice, you want to try to rely on, because it tends to have what we call the best statistical characteristics of any kind of central tendency measure or average. That said, you can't always use a mean, and we'll get into why. Okay, so what you want to do is understand. I thought I had the formula laid out here, but apparently I don't. But the X bar is the symbol for mean. I'm not going to get too much into symbols, because what you're going to see pretty shortly is that Excel does all of this for you, and you don't have to rely on knowing the symbols. But if you're reading a statistical report or a journal article, you're going to see some of this stuff. So it's good to be familiar with the basics of these symbols, but it can start to drive you crazy if you're not a statistician, but we have to start at some level. Okay, so X bar is the actual mean value of whatever data set you're looking at. And we're going to often call them scores, because that's normally what you have. It could be scores on a test, or it could be scores on a survey. So data, scores, same thing. When you see the symbol sigma, it means to add whatever follows it. Okay, sigma is just a fancy term for adding. When you see X but not X bar, X bar is the mean, but X is each individual score in a group. So you can have X1 and X2 and X3, which are score 1, score 2, and score 3. So think of the scores as you guys took a test, and she got a 55, and he got a 67, and she got an 89, and so on and so forth. Those are the X's. And then you're going to see N a lot. N is how many pieces of data you have, otherwise known as the sample size. So in this class, if I were to ask you your ages or your heights, you would all have various ages and various heights, but the N for that study would be 8, because there are 8 of you giving data on any particular characteristic. Okay, so it's literally the number of people you talk to in your study is your N. The way you compute a mean is you add up all the values, all the scores, and then you then divide through by the total number of values that you included in your sum. Okay, and so it's almost an insult to your intelligence to tell you how to calculate a mean. And furthermore, it doesn't matter, because we're going to do everything on Excel, which is my next slide. Now, what I do with these is I tend to not even focus on them. This is more for your reference to look back and figure out how to do all the stuff on Excel. What I do instead is I kind of introduce, what's the data we're going to look at on Excel. In this case, it's going to be a training competency exam. And then I'm going to pull up the Excel. Are you guys seeing the Excel now? Okay, good. Just had to make sure after all this craziness with the files not showing.
I don't think we're
seeing
seeing
your
it.
slide, not the actual Excel workbook.
You're not seeing the Excel. Okay, good. I'm glad I asked. Okay, so let's stop the share. And I'm going to do a new share with Excel. Here we go. All right, now you should see it, yes?
Yes.
Okay. So just a quick orientation. This slide is in your Moodle. It's under the statistics course materials if you ever want to play around with it. the good news, and I probably shouldn't say this, but I'm a nice guy and I'm in a good mood, so I'm going to say this, is you don't actually need to do this for the course. This is just more about learning how to use Excel. So when you eventually need to do these calculations, you have a quick way to do it. So that doesn't mean you shouldn't stop paying attention. It just means if some of this is getting like too much for you, then don't worry about it, because the whole point of it is not for you to memorize the steps. It's just to refer back to when you actually need to use it. But I didn't design the course in a way that you would actually actively use the Excel, just because I didn't want to bog everybody down with that. But again, this is your reference, so just appreciate it for what it is. And I promise you, you will use it in like finance, and take my marketing research course, it's in there too. So there's tons of use, and you should just know how to use it anyway. And I also know that different people have different levels of skill with Excel, so I'll take that into account as I go through these examples. Okay, so on the bottom of the slide, I'm sorry, of the Excel sheet is the different chapters. We're on chapter 2 now, and then when we go to 3, probably next week, you would click on that tab. But I'll do all the legwork here. We're in chapter 2, and then into chapter 2, we've got, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different data sets, and they're labeled according to what you're seeing in the slides. So let's focus on the training competency exam scores. We have 2 groups there, and what we want to do is just find a simple mean. So the way you do anything in Excel that requires a calculation is you always start with putting the cursor wherever you want to put it. I'm going to calculate the number here, and I'm going to label it mean to the left, and then I'm going to calculate the mean for group 1 here and the mean for group 2 here. But back to this cell, I'm going to say find me, or equals. You always start out with equals, and then to find the mean on Excel, you do average. Type in the word average, and you'll see a list of options comes up. You can click on any one of them. It's like an autocomplete, basically. Open parentheses, and then you'll see it's asking for numbers, number 1, number 2. You just drag over the numbers you want to take an average of. Here I'm just doing group 1. And then you close parentheses and hit the check box or return, and you've got the mean, for group 1, okay? And then most of the time you can just drag that out to the next column and it'll find the mean of group 2. And furthermore, these are ugly numbers. Who wants to work with so many decimal places? You go up to this little panel here and you just keep clicking until you get to where you want to be. And I like that, 44.9, 58.1, okay, are the means of the scores. So what do I do with this? Well, you know, most of the time you want to figure out which group did better, okay? So I'm looking at the mean for group 1, and it's 100. It's like any classic test. If you get a higher score, you're doing better. So the mean for group 1 is 44 and change, almost 45. And then the mean for group 2 is 58.1. So can I say, this is a question to all you guys in the studio audience, can I say that group 2 did better than group 1?
Yes.
Yeah, as an average.
Okay, I have, so how many yeses? Raise your hand if you say yes. Raise your hand if you say no, I can't tell. Okay, you're all wrong. That's the whole point I'm trying to make with the whole point of what statistics is about, is you cannot assume just because this number is higher than this number that this group did better than this group. Now, the likelihood is this group probably did better than that group. But like I said, the judge, who is statistics, always has the final say on whether that's actually true. And so what we're going to do in the coming weeks is figure out how do we have that judge, so to speak, make that final say as to whether the numbers are the same. But I don't blame you for saying what you said, because it's almost obvious that, or it is obvious, or it would seem obvious that 2 did better than 1, because 58 is much higher than 44.9. If I told you this was let's say this was 45 or even 46, okay, and then compare that against the 44.9, you know, then you might say, well, now I'm a little more skeptical that, you know, the group 2, it looks about the same, okay? But again, the whole point of statistics is don't even go there, because you can't say two numbers are different until the boss tells you they're different, and that's the idea. Okay, but at least you know how to calculate a mean, and that's good. Let's come back to the slides, and I'll ask you the same question again. Are you seeing the slides now? Negative.
Nope.
Okay. So
No.
okay, so then we stop the share, and I got to figure out this for next week why that's not happening. And I'm going to do a new share, and here we go back to. Okay, so we answered this question, and notice how I asked the question. Now you're seeing the slides, right? Okay.
Yep.
Notice how I asked the question very gingerly. I said, which group appears to have the higher score? I didn't say which one actually has the higher score, because we don't know at this point, which I know is mind-boggling. But hold that thought until a few weeks from now. We're going to talk about how you finally know. So things to remember about mean. First is we need to know either the big N or the little n, which is how many pieces of data we have. The big N means you have a population, which means you're talking to everybody. If it's the US, it would be 320 million people, but we almost never have that. The little n is how many people in your little group, the sample. Sample mean, so you can calculate both. The procedure for doing it is the same. You add up the values and you divide it by the number of values, or you just tell Excel to find an average. Same process. Sample mean, or really even population mean, is the measure that's going to best represent the population mean. Okay, so again, you're making inferences from sample to population. Are you wrong? Of course, you're always wrong. The cardinal rule in statistics is you're wrong by default. The question is, how wrong are you? That's what you always want to know, and we're going to figure out how to figure that out later. Now, these last two are important because you want to understand what's going on qualitatively with a mean. The mean is the center of the data set, okay? Which means that at that center point, whatever that mean gets calculated as, all the values to the left have the same weight as the values to the right of that mean. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you have, let's just say we have a data set. Our class is 8 people, right? So if you take a mean, does that mean that you have 4 values to the left and 4 values to the right? Well, no, not at all. That's going to be the next concept, which is median. What it's saying is that the weight of whatever values you have to the left of that mean is equal to the weight of the values you have to the right. And that's where it ends. So you could have a really, really big value on one of those sides that skews the mean in that direction. And that's what our last point here is, that the mean is very sensitive to outliers. Outliers are extreme scores that skew the mean in a certain direction. And I hesitate to say it's a big number or a small number because it depends on what the rest of the data set is looking like, right? It could be a big number just as much as it could be a small number. A small number can skew the data set in the wrong direction. So get out of the mindset of thinking that outliers are always big numbers. They usually are, but they don't have to be. They can be small numbers. It depends on where the rest of the data set is going. Let's look at an example. I have 2 data sets here. These are ages of people. And in one data set that I call even, what do we have? We got a 10, a 12, a 14, and 8. Basically kids and teenagers, okay? Basically, the numbers are kind of close to each other. Most of them, actually all of them actually. But when I look at the skewed sample, what's the deal? These numbers are basically close to each other, but then I get down to this guy down here, the 55. That number is far away from all of these. So this 55 would be an outlier in this particular data set, okay? But coming back to my first example, let's say all these ages were like 80, 90, 95, and then I put in an age of like 4. That's an example where a small value data data point is an outlier. Okay, so again, it doesn't necessarily mean high numbers, but the point is you look at this number relative to the other ones and you see that it's an outlier. Now, we're going to come back to ways that you can actually more scientifically test for a number being an outlier, so hold that thought. I want to talk about weighted means and show you how to do them. But sometimes you will see data organized this way. This is just basically a list of numbers, and that's it. Sometimes data will be organized in a tally format where you say, okay, what's the data point? It's a score of 1 to 5 on a product satisfaction survey of some sort. Like where 1 is I'm not satisfied at all, 5 is I'm highly satisfied or very satisfied. And then to summarize, we say how many people gave it a score of 1, how many people gave it a score of 2, how many people gave it a score of 3, and so on and so forth. So we just tally the results in the rightmost column. And from that, you can do what's called a weighted average. And again, I'm not going to go through each step here. I'm just going to show it to you on Excel. So let's go back to the Excel. I'm going to do a new share and get Excel back up here. So that's the same data here. You're seeing my Excel, yes? Yes? Okay, good.
Yeah.
So again, same data that you saw on the slide. How do I do a weighted average? So I'm going to call this weighted average. Actually, no, I'm sorry. I'm going to call this. So first of all, let me just extend this guy a little bit so the word frequency shows. And then I'm going to call this the product column. And what you literally do is you take the score. So I'm going to say equals the score times, using that asterisk for times, the frequency, and click the checkbox. No, yeah, 1 times 25 is 25. Big revelation, right? So now I can just drag that whole formula down, and it's going to calculate products for all these other rows. So now I have products for each of them, and then I'm going to put a line here for style, and then say to Excel, find me the sum of all these products. So I'm going to say equals sum and drag through the data. Again, I know if you're not an Excel guru or you have no Excel skills, this is all new to you, but I'm assuming you have some, or you can learn it, and you'll learn it as we go anyway. So I'm taking the sum of everything above it, and I get that 694. To figure out the weighted average, I'll just call it WA. I'm going to say, take that 694, I'm going to click right on it, and divide through by, you can do it this way, the sum of the frequencies. So now I'm calculating as an intermediate quantity the sum of all those numbers in the frequency column. And what do we get? So I'm going to clean this up a little bit. 3.1 is the weighted average of this data set, okay? Because you have, look at it, so basically most of the data is happening here in these 3 numbers. So you would expect the mean of this data set to be somewhere in the 3 to 5 range, because the higher frequencies are here. But actually, no, that's not true. We have a 2 that has a lot, but 1 doesn't have that many. So yeah, you would think it would be somewhere in the the low 3s range, because you're seeing a lot of data here and a super lot of data here, and then a lot here, but not as much here and here. So this 3.1 should make kind of qualitative sense to you, that it would be kind of right in the middle, okay? But that's how you do a weighted average, and you do a weighted average when you have this layout of your data, the score and the frequency. But it's the same thing as taking a regular average, because I could have listed out 25, sorry, the score of 1 25 times. So I would take this and drag it all the way down 25 times. I could have done however many 2s there are and drag that down. I won't keep doing it. And then I would have taken an average of that by doing equals average. But that would take way too long, take up too much space. And so this is a nice format that you're going to see in very many applications and statistics. Okay. That is weighted average. Let's go back to the slides. We are almost done for the evening, I promise. Okay, so back to the slides. Median. Think about, when you see a median on a highway, what does a median do? It splits the road into 2 basically equal halves, right? So an equal number of drivers on the left, an equal number of drivers on the right side of the road. And that's what median is doing for numbers or data sets. It's the middle point of the data set, which is not necessarily the central point of the data set like it is with mean, and we'll make those distinctions in just a few minutes. So here's how you do mean. Again, you're almost never going to do this by hand because Excel does everything, and just use Excel or some statistical package. We use Excel because it's the most widespread available package there is to do statistics. It's cheap, almost free for most people, and it's the least complex. Okay, so when you're finding a median in a data set, you have to organize data in order. Okay, so if I look at these two data sets down here, 1, 2, 3 is in perfect order. I don't care if it's 3, 2, 1 or 1, 2, 3. The point is it's in order. This data set is not, so we have to rearrange it either as 7, 5, 4 or 4, 5, 7. But okay, let's get your data in order and then just pick the middle score. So in this set, the middle score is 2. That's pretty easy. In this set, the middle score is 5 after you rearrange it in order. Okay, and so those are your medians. Your medians are 2 and 5. It's the point in the middle. Now let's up the complexity a little bit. What if we have 2 scores in the middle? So let's look at data set 1, 4, 6, 8, 10. Okay, it's in order. That's good. Problem 1 solved. But okay, what's the middle? So if I try to find, knock one off here, knock one off here, knock one off here, the middle is like right here. So what's the middle? Middle is actually the mean of the 2 most middle data points. So what's the mean of 6 and 8? Well, you could calculate it, but you also know, just quickly, it's 7. Okay, or if you don't like that, take 6 and 8, add them up, it's 14, divided by 2 is 7. So sometimes when you're finding a median, you're actually finding a mean of the 2 most middle data points. Okay, let's look at this one. Similar situation. The middle point is right here. If I literally, the middle point, there's 2 data on the left, 2 pieces of data on the right, just like there's 2 here and 2 here. You have to have an equal number on the left and right. So what's the rule? Take the mean of the middle data points. What's the mean of 5 and 5? 5, right? You didn't have to calculate anything there. You know it's 5. So the median of this data set is 5. Do you even have to worry about this? No, but I just want you to understand qualitatively how these things get calculated. So if anybody asks you, you know. Now, if we use Excel to find the median, I'm going to skip down to the punchline here. And we're going to look at this age distortion example because it has some interesting questions. And let's go back to the Excel spreadsheet. Seeing it all? Yes? Excel? Yes, yes, yes. Okay.
Yes.
Great. So we are now over here to the right, and I have a unimodal data set. I'm sorry, no, we're going to use the age distortion example data set. Sorry. Okay, and so let's start out with the median first. So I'm going to label this median. And then we're also going to do a mean later because I have a point I want to make, which is the point of the slide we just left. So how do you do a median on Excel? Easy as pie. Equals median, open parenthesis, highlight the data you want to find the median of, and then close parenthesis, check mark, done. I'm going to drag it over now to the other data set, and it's going to give me a median there. And then I'm also going to find some averages or means, which you already know how to do. So let's take that data and pull it over to find the same thing over here. And I'm going to just clean this up a little bit so that we have, okay, so focusing on the median, what's going on here? Well, first of all, you notice the median is not a data point in either of these sets. That's going to happen because, again, what happened here is you had to find the average of the 2 middle points of data. So don't think, this goes for mean too. Most of the time, the number you get is not in the data set at all that you originally started with. That's okay. That's going to happen most of the time. Okay, so the median was higher for the skewed data set than the even data set. And then when I found means, it's the same result. But I want you to notice something really crucially important here. We put this 55 in the skew data set because we wanted to screw things up. We wanted an outlier in there, okay? Because I want to make a point, which is, look what happens to the median versus the mean when you have that outlier. The median doesn't really change much when you have that. In fact, you could say it doesn't really change at all. It only changed a little bit because these numbers are different from these numbers, but it had nothing to do with the fact that that 55 was in there. The mean, on the other hand, got dragged upward a lot because of that 55. Okay? And what do we say? Mean is very sensitive to outliers. This is an outlier. There's no outliers in this data set. This is your outlier here in this data set. So, which number would I trust? In this particular case, if I'm going to compare the two sets of data, I would rather look at median than mean because of this number. It's not that this is useless information. It's just I don't trust that 14.5 because of what 55 did to it, because again, it's too sensitive to outliers. So you have to make these judgment calls, and then really at the end of the day, they're not judgment calls because you'll have an easy way to figure out what's an outlier and what isn't, and that should help you, but we'll get to that next time probably. Okay, so let's stop sharing here, go back to the slide. Nope, that didn't work. All right, new share. Back to my slide, share that. Okay. So let's answer the questions. When we compare the medians and the means, which is a better measure of central tendency? In this case, the median. Why? Because we had that 55 outlier over here, which screwed up the use of the mean. So the moral of the story is, and this is my next slide, things to remember. Because the median doesn't care about outliers, it doesn't reflect outliers, extreme scores or outliers don't affect the median, whereas they do affect the mean. Therefore, the mean is not a good measure of central tendency. Okay. I think what I'm going to do is call it a night there because I'm out of voice and you're probably tired. And let's just, any questions, thoughts, comments at this point? What do I do for next? Let me cover that actually quickly. So I'm going to reshare my Moodle, which I have to find, of course. It's never where you want it to be when you want it to be there. Ah, here it is. All right. So everybody see Moodle? Yes?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So what can you do between now? Again, you can work at your own pace. I don't care when you get this done, but I'd rather you do it along the contours of the course. So what do we cover? Economic mindset, supply and demand. That's what we did in micro. And then we didn't do any macros, not until a couple weeks from now. Statistics, we did this, and we did half to 3/4 of measures of central tendency. So if you want to start working on, for sure, this one, part of this one, and then this one and this one, all of it, that would be an appropriate thing for you to do for next week as far as the homeworks go. Okay? Now, remember again, for next week, we want you to come prepared with one thought about the reading or anything we discussed this week, and then we'll kind of go round robin and let you do some of the talking so that you don't have to get too overly bored listening to me for 3 hours. So any thoughts or questions? Nope. Okay. Then I will bid you adieu. Have a great night. Again, we're trying to make your life really easy here. So this course should be fun and very streamlined for you. So don't stress. No stress allowed. And then obviously get in touch with any questions during the week. Texting me is the easiest way to get in touch with me. And my number's on the syllabus. So, but do what you want, whatever you need to do. Okay, we're good?
Thank you.
We'll see you next week,
Thank you,
same
Jordan.
time. Okay, good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Okay.